Hi, this is Paul. What I've done with this video is because this is such a major, I think, vitally important episode of Jordan's podcast, his conversation with Jonathan Pageau. It's vitally important for me. It's right there at the top of the hierarchy. It's my dream come true. One of my friends said, I'm watching the original before I watch your commentary, and I can imagine how happy you are. Like a pig in mud, buddy. But I'm doing so much of it. I put out 2 episodes today on the 1st of March, but I'm going to compile all of these into one that I'm going to put out on the 2nd of March. And I didn't release any audio only podcasts. They'll all go out tomorrow. And what I'm going to try and do is segment these in so with what YouTube has the little things underneath so you can if you've already watched some of the ones you can start where you haven't watched. Okay, I'm going to try and do that. But I'm only halfway through this video, so I've got to come back to it. It was an amazing conversation. It was an amazing conversation, and I'm super glad it happened. The Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pageau podcast is out. Why wait? This is Paul. No PowerPoint. One night's sleep. Let's jump in. So I received word about the podcast from a friend who was on the channel via Twitter. It was late. I wasn't going to go to bed until I listened to it. That meant I stayed up late. That's just the way it goes. I listened to it, had a variety of things. I tweeted a few things as it went, but then after listening to it the first time, I wrote this Twitter thread, which I'll read, and maybe that will give me some orientation. It's always difficult when I work without a PowerPoint. Now, for those of you who are going to leave the comment that what you did was ramble and interject, yes, that is exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to ramble and interject. And if that's not your cup of tea, you can leave the video right now because that's exactly what's coming. That's most of my channel. So there it is. These are all first drafts and rough drafts on this channel for the most part. That's how I use this channel. So if you come here for the Peterson stuff, there's lots and lots and lots of little sites with clips, and there's the work itself. Look at that. It's all there. What I do on this channel is I basically give you my thoughts as I go through it. That's what at least my monologues are about, or my commentaries are about. So here we go. After the first run listening to it, this is the Twitter thread that I wrote. I'll likely do an initial take on Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau conversation tomorrow. Here it is. I had 3 or 4 videos in mind this evening, wondering which one of them would emerge tomorrow. Then the conversation surfaced on Peterson's podcast. The internal debate was over. That's shot right up to the top of the hierarchy. The big impression I have is the repeated haunting question of Peterson. Peterson asks, why hasn't the church manifest this vision of theosis sufficiently that, and I want to pause right there because it's just at that moment we understand the ache, we understand the shortcoming. And Peterson gets at this a number of different times and ways in the conversation, but you can't finish the sentence. No one can finish the sentence. We all want to finish the sentence. The end of the sentence pulls us towards us. In fact, at one point in Jordan's talks with Sam Harris, gosh, how many times have I listened to those things? Especially the first one. The future is like, and this is Harris's words, and it's his words of sort of unbelief. The future is like a tractor beam. It pulls us in. That's exactly the motion that's happening when Peterson, in many different ways, reiterates this. He both expresses the terror of it, that if this is actually true, it's terrifying. That gets expressed in Ion. Of course, the Uber Boyos did a very interesting series on Ion. This is the heart of where Peterson is at. Now, a haunting question with Peterson is, for a lot of people who are sort of keeping their eyes on the tribal markers, is he moving or isn't he? And I would say right off the bat, don't listen to his words, watch his actions. And you say, well, I can't watch his actions because I'm not watching him. And that's exactly right. And that's the way it is with almost everyone. And this is something you learn very quickly as a pastor. Words are important. Actions speak louder than words. If you want to know what someone truly believes, Jordan Peterson says, watch their actions. And this entire conversation is haunted by this question of will he act, can he act? But it's also haunted by the fact that Jordan is, in many ways, continues to be disabled because of the Benzo withdrawal and all of the medical stuff that has gone through there. So, yeah, it's one heck of a story. So the big impression I have is the repeated haunting question of Peterson asks about why hasn't the church manifested this vision of theosis sufficiently that, or even to turn it from the church, which is out there, second person to him, to first person. What if I go further in this? Where does this lead me? And that's where we're sort of with Tolkien and the Hobbits. If Gandalf comes knocking and dwarves fill your house, and that's pretty much what's already happened to Jordan's life. The dwarves via YouTube have filled his living room and both given him gold, but also are inviting him out of the door. You don't know where it'll take you. And that's Tolkien. I think Jonathan Pageau is right that some version of theosis is at the heart of Christian eschatology. And in my tweet, I quote Colossians 1:15 and following. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. Notice behavior right there. But now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. If you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. Now, later, read the whole book. It's the book of Colossians, and then keep reading. It's all in there, but we don't have eyes to see. We struggle to understand. But so Pageau talks about theosis, and I think Pageau is right that at the heart of Christian eschatology, this is where it goes. Now, right away, other traditions, including my own, will pause and say, and that is the theologian's life, to stop and say, well, what exactly do you mean by theosis? What exactly do you mean by God? And you'll find it in Paul being in Christ. And this is why certain forms of Christianity that reduce it to going to heaven, well, it doesn't. That's there, but it's very low definition, because then you have to ask, well, what is heaven? And it goes on and on and on and on from there. So I think Pageau is right that all true Christianity winds up in some version of theosis. It's union with Christ, Loose Meads, Christian Reformed Church. It's being in Christ, Paul of Tarsus. It's eternal life, the Johannine part of the New Testament. It's the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, Synoptic Gospels. It's through and through and through and through, and there's lots of different ways to say it, but it's union with God through Christ. That's Christianity, okay? Jordan's haunting question is the question I hear asked in 100 different forms and ways inside and outside the church. It is implicit in every cry of despair and longing for shalom. We ache to be in Christ, as Paul said. John says it in its own way. A great verse to read this in is Romans 8. where Paul sort of sets up the dichotomies of this and talks about the groaning, and the Spirit groans on our behalf. This is basic Christianity, but the folk versions tend to prevail, which is sort of natural. And I think Pageau is right when he talks about hierarchies in this sense, that this stuff gets so complicated so fast. And Pageau is also right in that outside the body of the church, see, the church as a larger body, as a Voltron, allows the different members of the body, this is what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians, allows the different members of the body to participate in the body. And so, I thought Jonathan Pageau did quite well in this conversation, but understanding Pageau takes a while for a lot of us who are deeply formed by secularity and the materialist, instrumentalist ways of thinking and inhabiting this world. And I think you can map all of that onto Paul and epithumia, the over desires. This is, see, part of what makes all of these conversations difficult is that anyone who listens to me has to know something enough to have this stuff map onto it. And the truly amazing speakers, Christ at the center of it himself, talk in a way that simultaneously disrupts and invites deeper into. And that's very clearly what Jordan has done. And I think Pageau is right that Jordan sort of stands on two continents. And I thought that was right. Other repeated strands of the conversation: worship and attention. And I think Pageau is right. And that gets into the cognitive science. That gets into the Vervaeke stuff. I think about Mark Lefebvre, who I had a conversation with, how he's been pursuing the Vervaeke stuff. Mark makes this point again and again and again to people on the Discord server. I hear him make it, and he's right that this is how we work. And Peterson a little bit later in the conversation talks about, if you merely dismiss it as imaginative, you live, and he says, via Jung, you live in your imagination. That's all you have. That's who you are. To think that you are this skin-enveloped sack of fluids, and that is your most basic self, is not a human being. Because in the Civil War, I got to take your arm or it's going to gangrene. Take the arm, doc. You'll keep the arm for what? And this is why decapitation is such a brutal thing for us, because we do live in our heads, metaphorically. Other strands: worship, attention, and trust. Not simply cognitive assents, but living into, up to. And Jordan actually had a really good way of articulating that I haven't yet integrated yet and can't pull up, but as I go through the video, I will. And again, a disclaimer: I do these videos because I'm thinking out loud. And so if you want settled conclusions, you'll have to get me in a different format. This is the format for this for me. So if you don't like it, unsubscribe. And every time the algorithm pops my face up on your feed, tell Google, no, thank you. That's fine with me. So other repeated strands of the conversation: worship, attention, and trust. Not simply cognitive assent, but living into, up on. Of course, produce the ache. How long, O Lord, how long? The most poignant moment for me was Jordan talking about his pain blocking his capacity for joy. And that's a little bit earlier than later when Jonathan says, yeah, but you're not, in a sense, this is so... Pentecostals will talk about a covering. Pageau here is talking about a covering. And in a sense, if you can sort of see through the language of the different traditions, you can notice how they're actually holding together and running parallel to each other. I can deeply resonate with Jordan's disappointment and frustration with the church. And in fact, the video I was likely going to make today, which will probably seep out in all kinds of ways in what I say today, the video I was likely going to make was just experiencing the fact that I've got a deep frustration and disappointment with the vessel. It's, as some Christian writers talk about, the problem of wineskins, with the vessel of the church in terms of how it facilitates the movement of Christ through the world. That's really the church's job, to facilitate the movement of Christ through the world, to be his witness. Now, the church does this badly, and has always done it badly. Now, a little bit later, Esther had a comment. On one hand, I get Peterson's frustration. On the other hand, it's hard not to be hard on him, but he should realize that much of the church's best and noblest work is going to be unsung and unnoticed from a bird's eye outside perspective. And that's exactly right. Because, and this is why I say what I say a little bit later, that despite my deep frustration with the church, it's sort of a John 6 moment. Where else am I going to go? Who else has the words of life? And when I say church, I don't just mean the Christian Reformed Church or the Roman Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church or the Protestant churches. I mean that Christ does work through his church, but he also works through history. Christ plays in 10,000 places. So I can deeply resonate with Jordan's disappointment and frustration with the church, but as Esther says, you haven't seen much of it, Jordan. And what you see via the media, well, if you look at how you're treated in the media, think of how the church is treated, okay? The media is not some unbiased canal through which the world comes to us. It can't be, by virtue of the Pageauian attention principle, okay? And so the only way to see the church is to be in the church, but then you have the problem of the only way to see the church is to be in a church. And actually, Lewis talks about this, because you have to then learn to see the whole church through a church, no matter how poor that church is at doing what Christ calls it to do. And so there's always this process of purification, which is, of course, what the Protestant Reformation is about. It's what Reform is about. And again, it's Tom Holland's noticing this continual movement of reformation within the history of the church. Christ initiates that and launches it. You can find it in the Hebrew prophets. René Girard notices this too, this continual capacity to self-critique without being destroyed. In some ways, it's the burning bush. It's the consuming fire. It's the altar outside the tabernacle to which Aaron's sons attempt to bring alien fire, and they are destroyed for it. It's that process of continual renewal and perfection that, and this is where Jordan goes when he's talking about the better. We sort of always look for the better, and that's right. And this is embodied in Christianity in this perpetual renewal. This might be strange because I'm, of course, deeply inside. Okay, I can deeply resonate with Jordan's disappointment and frustration with the church. That might seem strange because I am, of course, deeply inside of it. But I've got 1,000 stories of its shortcomings to the few that he has. Yet I won't give her up. I won't give up the bride of Christ. I'm part of her. And being part of her is how I'm united with Christ. Sounds odd for a Protestant to say, but that was really the beating heart of the Protestant Reformation. It's this discouragement that, and it's in this way that Jordan is deeply Protestant, because he looks at the church and says, this? And Christ says, she's my bride. She's a mess. Read the book of Ezekiel. It's always been this way. And that's why Pageau's emphasis on See, again, if I use theosis, I trigger people in other traditions, but it's the path towards Christ. It's moving into Christ. It's becoming like Christ. The different traditions say it in different ways. Perhaps it's analogous to the young person who avoids marriage because they watch the failure of their parents' marriage. Avoiding marriage doesn't actually solve much. It just means you miss out on the potential a covenant union affords. And that's the appeal I hear from Jonathan throughout. I'm sure I'll have more to say tomorrow. Here I am. After I sleep on it and listen to it again, I'm about 2/3 of the way through my second listening. I'll continue to pray for both Jordan and Jonathan because I think their work, the work they are doing, is vital for the next stages of Western Christianity, far more than most see. And if I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be doing this channel. I wouldn't have, I remember early on, lots of different criticisms and critiques. Why are you spending so much time on Jordan Peterson? Why don't you talk about Jesus? I say, well, look at my day job. I talk about Jesus all day long. The church has not known how to connect Jesus to the world very well. That's a deeply complex dynamic. I think what I'm going to do now is just end this recording and then start the commentary. And maybe I'll put this at the beginning of the commentary video. So here's a little short introduction for those of you who want a short video. And one person tweeted me, my brother says he's really hoping for a 2+ hour one. And I don't know how much time I have today to do that. Part of it is the more successful I get, the more the success, the more I have to manage the success. And Jesus had that all the time. And you read it in the Gospels. It's again and again, Jesus goes away to a lonely place to pray. And you might think, well, what is he doing? Is he getting information? No. He's being in the Father so that those who are in him can also be in the Father. Again, read the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John says that again and again and again and again. So I'm gonna cut this off here. I'm gonna post it, and I'm gonna keep going. So let's get into the actual meat of the conversation. They begin with some They begin with some catching up with each other on a personal level, talking about the flooded Pageau's home and no sound. Okay, let's get into the commentary.
No, I appreciate that a lot, and I'm back to some degree. I would say I still think I'm running at about 5%. So yeah, and that's partly why I was concerned about talking to you today. We're generally discuss things that are relatively deep, and it's still difficult for me to go deeply into anything that's happening to me because it's so unbelievably awful. And it's been hard on my faith, I would say, and my book is coming out, my new.
It's an interesting hard on his faith. I'd love to know. As a pastor, I'd say, what do you mean by that?
Book, I should show it to you. I just got copies of it yesterday.
That's
Beyond
awesome.
Order.
It's unbelievable that you wrote that during all of this. I can't believe
that is true. I
believe that when you say you're running at 5%, I think that your 5% is pretty close to the 100% of most people.
Yeah, well, I don't know if that's true or not, but it's 5% for me. And getting the book was actually somewhat of a traumatic experience, I would say, because it reminded me, like it's a concrete reminder of everything that's happened over the last 3 or 4 years, and with all things that I found very difficult to process, both on the social front and on the, let's say, biological health front. So I was reading, oddly enough, I got a book sent to me by Bishop Barron, the first draft of a book, and it's written by a couple of professors. It's called Jordan Peterson, God and Christianity, The Search for a Meaningful Life.
Oh, that's interesting.
By Dr. Christopher Kaczor and Dr. Matthew Petrusek. Word on Fire Institute. It's a Catholic response to my biblical series.
It's about 3 years later, but Roman Catholic Church is very long perspective organization.
Now, hopefully they won't be too upset about me talking about it today, but I won't talk about it that much. The book itself, it was rather a shock to me. They're at Loyola Marymount University, and it was kind of a shock to me to see them talking about these are religious scholars talking about my biblical series.
That shouldn't be a shock. Although I can understand, it shouldn't be a shock. It is.
But I think a lot of people didn't understand. And I could see it in my reaction with the.
I'd have to say, looking back a couple of years, boy, there's a host of things I didn't understand. And again, if you didn't hear the disclaimer in the first part of the videos, these videos are thinking out loud for me. That's what they are.
People were reacting to your biblical studies, your biblical interpretations. People didn't understand, how is it that we can barely get 100 people in our church, and Jordan has 1 million people listening to him kind of struggle to get through these passages and do it in a very improvisational kind of existential way.
I like the cat.
And to me, it's funny because I think I have a deep affection for the way that you approach things, and obviously we connect together in the way we think. And so to me, it was like, this is what you guys should have been doing for a while, is trying to understand how it is that this stuff is talking about reality.
And Pageau's point is right, and it's a point that I've made again and again and again. I guess it's a point of it's easy to get lost and stay lost, and it's easy for traditions to get lost and stay lost, and you stay within your tradition, and again, it's just a phenomenal thing what has happened, and I still don't think the church has paid enough attention to it. Now we'll see what happens down the road. We'll see.
And not just a bunch of arbitrary things that you need to believe or that you need to kind of attend to, and because these stories, they really are telling us about the structure of being. And so I think that that's the way that you approach
it. It's important to mention, it's important to note that when Pageau says the structure of being here, it's fairly Heideggerian, and Heidegger's not, in terms of theology and philosophy, Heidegger is very, very recent. And I mean that in terms of that language. And part of what we're wrestling with is that as we sort of continue to go down the road, language continues to evolve for important reasons. And yeah.
Approached it. And that's why people are resonating to what you're saying, because they're like, finally, someone can help us make sense of these stories that we're somehow strangely attracted to, or frustrated by, or disgusted by, or whatever it is. But there's this push and pull with these stories. And so I think that I've seen a lot of Christians listen to your biblical talks. And of course, sometimes you say things and they're like, okay, that's way off the rails.
Meek.
And then other times you say things and they can't believe the insight that you're able to pierce. And so I'm not at all surprised that Catholic scholars would kind of look at what you were doing. And we all hope that you're going to do more of that for sure.
Yes, well, I would like to. I'm thinking about trying to attempt a book on Exodus and lectures as well.
A book? I got a whole row of Exodus books up there. This is going to be interesting.
Although I wouldn't say that I'm in any shape to do that yet. But it's a dream, let's say. I mean, I'm pretty much completely non-functional for the first 3 or 4 hours of the day.
This part is quite, wow. This is, I know a lot of people who have chronic pain. Pain is a weird thing. It's not just physical. Pain is a strange thing. And in fact, if you want to get a look into the mystery of what we are, just look at pain. Because some people can have no physical pain, but they're completely debilitated by depression or anxiety. I mean, these are forms of psychological pain. Well, why would psychological pain so utterly disable us? But yeah, Jordan sort of lays out his picture here. And if you look at, Tammy's had an interview And then also, I haven't watched the talk that she did with her daughter, although I was deeply charmed by it. I mean, who can't be charmed by a mother-daughter conversation like that? It's just so beautiful. But you get the picture that, you know, Tammy's doing okay and has been restored to a degree of normalcy in her life. But Jordan, it's an uphill battle.
Get up and I can barely stand up, and I go have a sauna for an hour and often sleep during that period of time. And then at the same time, I cook breakfast. I use an air cooker, and then I go walk for anywhere between 7 and 10 miles. And even though by the time I get out of the house, I'm dizzy as can be, and it's difficult to stand up. But after about a mile or two, I get my legs under me to some degree.
Just get the picture of this. Oh my goodness, it's just really hard.
And then by 2 o'clock, I'm kind of functional, and although extremely anxious. And then I'm able to do a little bit of work, and often to sit down at 4 o'clock. My mind seems sharp enough, although my memory isn't good. I can't bring things to mind like I used to, which is quite distressing. And I have very little emotional resilience, and I'm worried for that reason about the release of this book.
The guy just works. And, you know, he's right to be worried about the release of this book, because what we've already seen is Jordan is just a magnet for contention.
I mean, I just did a London Times interview that was really
difficult, we followed that.
Let's say
it's that frustrating. It's. I mean, it's funny because this, you know, again, it was like the same stories are playing out again. This person goes after you, and then it just turns against that person, and it's just she's exposed for the fraud that she was being and during that interview. And so, you know, I think in the end,
it's so strange that it keeps happening.
You know, again, I get back to what one person in our local meetup said. Jordan just keeps needing to get into fights. Why would he want that? Well, he obviously doesn't want that, but it's this dynamic. And actually, this person's brother, just Sunday, we were talking about it in the parking lot, and you know, he said it's sort of the dynamic of truth. It's sort of the prologue of John, that you hate the truth, and so you buck up against it, but the truth endures. That's just what truth is.
Happening over and over.
Playing out again. This person goes after you, and then it just turns against that person, and it's just she's exposed for the fraud that she was being and during that interview. And so, you know, I think in the end,
it's so strange that it keeps happening over and over. I mean, I've really decided not to do mainstream interviews now for a good while, because
I agree. Don't talk to mainstream interviews, because
it seems to me that I've gone to the well of public sympathy, so to speak, enough times, and that if this happens to me 2 or 3 more times, let's say, people are going to rightly say, you know, how many times does it take for Peterson to learn? And
again, I mean, this kind of self-critique and
so I don't want that to happen. I mean, I've been, you know, I feel an obligation to my publishers, obviously, to talk about the book. Although that interview had virtually nothing to do with the book. We hope that I would be able to discuss my health issues with someone who would.
And I just saw that something just dropped on Dave Rubin, so he did that obviously with Dave Rubin. And part of the problem here is that there's no right way to do anything. And yeah,
treat them squarely, and then I could ignore them from then on in. But that isn't what happened.
Well, it's a sign of the politicized discourse. Like it's a sign of the breakdown that we're going through, that we see this capacity to have so entrenched a side that.
Now Jonathan's choice of words, breakdown, I think is helpful. And the relationship between politics is now, religion is always. Increasing politicization is, I think, a sign of the crumbling of the substructures beneath politics that allow politics to be peaceful. And, you know, Pageau has been sort of a dark prophet in this. And I fear he's right.
People doesn't matter what they do. It doesn't matter what they say. They don't feel like they're responsible because in a way you're the enemy. And, and it's not just you, it's it's between different groups. But if you're the enemy, then everything is justified. And so,
well, I think a huge part of this is driven by the desire to have an enemy.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great point. You need an enemy because why isn't this gets into what I talked about a little bit when I was talking about the tweet. This gets into, well, why isn't the world better? Well, it must be someone's fault. Well, whose fault is it? Well, and then you go around and you look for an enemy. And generally speaking, seek and you shall find, for good or for bad, with a whole lot of things. And so people need an enemy. They want an enemy because if you have an enemy, then you're not to blame. Part of the video I was thinking about making today was just reflecting on the sermon I preached in the beginning of Luke 13, where, Jesus is on his way down to Jerusalem, and what people really want from Jesus when he gets to Jerusalem is to attack the Romans and to overthrow their puppet regime in Jerusalem and to begin a great campaign of retaking the nation, of making Israel great again. And Jesus won't do it. And so some people burst in and they tell a story about Pilate spilling the blood of some Galileans while they were conducting their sacrifice. And if you read biblical commentators on this, there's a lot of question as to whether or not this is fake news. I mean, now the fact that I have a language to appropriate that, and you all can understand it just by saying fake news. Well, and then, of course, I read Kenneth Bailey's, you can look at the rough draft. The sermon changed maybe 70% between the rough draft and Sunday this week. The sermon is up on the church website, or not on the church website, but on the church YouTube page. I really have to catch up on the website. But they really wanted to corner Jesus into being their hero. And he would not be cornered. And this is part of the reason everyone could agree on his death. Otherwise, those who were hoping for a restoration of Judean nationalism in the first century would have protected him, but they at that point had given up on him. And I think in many ways, my scenario, at least everybody's got their ideas about why Judas did what he did. My scenario is that Judas finally gave up on him, and he could see that he could make some money, and so he sold him out. But then he had second thoughts.
Yeah,
it's very difficult to feel. It's an easy route to self-righteousness to have an enemy.
And again, if you look at the sermon, that's what Kenneth Bailey says. Kenneth Bailey lived in the 70s during the Lebanese Civil War, and he watched all of these dynamics, and he wrote about them in his commentary on Luke's parables.
Exactly.
And it's a great place to put all evil.
Yeah. And because you attract so much attention, you're definitely an easy target.
Well, that's the theory. It seems not to turn out that way.
Yeah. But it's also
it seems not to turn out that way because Jordan keeps winning.
Timing, the way when you kind of came up in the public sphere, there was a massive shift happening in culture. And I think that's one of the things you could feel and that was happening around us. And to some extent, Donald Trump had something to do with that as well, in the sense that it was this malaise that was there and this kind of this jostling and this is what led to all that kind of discourse. And so I think that you became identified almost mythologically, I guess, as a character, and people, have.
And I think that's an outstanding observation by Jonathan, that he becomes a character. And again, I've talked a lot about, at least I did in the question and answer Friday mornings. I do a question and answer Friday mornings Pacific time, the Bridges of Meaning Discord, and we talk about stuff. But we project onto the world, and Peterson talked about this a lot with his Roger Scruton conversation, which I thought was an excellent conversation. It's one of his best, where we see, as Peterson said, sort of these low resolution cartoons, and that's the projection that we're doing. And so now now many, okay, why hasn't utopia emerged? Well, it's because of the enemy. Well, who is the enemy? And the enemy may be people on the right, or the enemy may be people on the left. But you have to you create characters in your narrative, and that's how we participate. That's how we become personally involved.
Treat you that way, and they act with you that way in many of discourse. And so us. And to some extent, Donald Trump had something to do with that as well, in the sense that it was this malaise that was there, and this kind of this jostling, and this is what led to all that kind of discourse. And so I think that you became identified almost mythologically, I guess, as a character, and people, have treat you that way, and they act with you that way in many respects.
Yes, and it becomes very difficult it's become very difficult for me to understand what character I am.
This is one of the more interesting parts of this, what character I am, because we know who we are by the people around us. I mean, we're always doing this orientation with others. And of course, this is part of the reason I think Jordan approaches his work life now sort of as Peterson Family Inc., because you have to keep people before the disorientation. And so Pageau's on that list. Pageau is a friend that he knew before this wave. And so he can trust Pageau because he knows Pageau isn't to surf Peterson for Pageau's own interests. And so there's a degree of trust there. And you have that with people early on. So, but Jordan has to figure out who he is based on all of the other people around him.
Have treat you that way, and they act with you that way in many respects.
Yes, and it becomes very difficult it's become very difficult for me to understand what character I am. So much has changed in my life over the last 5 years. I've been on leave from the university, so that's very destabilizing. I don't have my clinical practice anymore, and so I was, seeing 20 people a week. So that's a huge transformation in my life. My house has been completely renovated. It was renovated while my wife was ill, and so we didn't. The renovation went on in our absence, and so I'm a foreigner in my own house, which is, although I'm starting to become accustomed to it, and there's some things I like about the new house, but I don't feel at home in it, I wouldn't say. And I've only been here for 2 months in the last 3 years because I was on the road, and then, all this, and so and everything that's happened has been very disruptive for my family. And of course, Tammy got so unbelievably sick and with something.
And, both of his children in this time span have gotten married and have children of their own. Again, you think about, despite the fact of his status rocket and his wealth, I don't wish what happened to Jordan on anyone. It's just chaos.
That was supposed to be fatal and recovered more or less miraculously. And then I've been so unbelievably ill, or still am, and I just don't know where to put any of this. I can't think about the past at all because so much of it is incomprehensible, especially over the last 5 years. I can't think about the present because I'm in so much pain, and I can't think about the future because I don't know what I'm going to do, and I have no idea how long this pain is going to last. I've been in pain, really severe pain, for 2 years now, and that's
astounding.
It's a strange thing because in this book, one of the chapters, the last chapter, is called "Be Grateful in Spite of Your Suffering."
I think he's talking about Beyond Order.
And I went through every sentence in that chapter a very large.
That makes me nervous for the book.
Number of times, because much of the time while I was rewriting it, particularly, I was in a lot of pain. And I'm
very interested to see how this book reads as a book. Now, I assume he had, he never talks about his editor. I assume, a major publishing house is going to demand that he have an editor, and the relationship between the author and the editor is always an interesting one, because the editor sort of takes the book out of the author's hands to a degree, and it's a subtle interplay. And if it, I doubt Jordan had an edit. I don't know if Jordan had an editor for Maps of Meaning. But this is going to impact this book. Whatever he writes is going to sell. I mean, that's what Penguin Publishing certainly knows, a la McLean's thing. I thought I'd be making a video about that.
It's a pain level that's hard to fathom in some sense, because I would say every single day I have now is worse than any day I ever had in my life before.
Every single day I have now is worse, than any single day I had in my life before now.
I got ill.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then I know very well that adding bitterness to your malaise is a very bad idea. It doesn't help. But that I can certainly see the attraction in that. I feel like shaking my fist at the sky and complaining bitterly, but it doesn't help. But there doesn't seem to be any relief either. And so it's so.
And I really appreciate what he said about bitterness, both in the recording that he released with the Times and what he says here, because the instinctive thing is to shake your fist at the sky, and it doesn't help like you want it to. Just again, read the book of Job.
So perverse, it's shaken my faith, I suppose.
It's the second time he says that.
I'm in this perverse position where my work has in principle helped so many people, and yet I don't seem to be able to dig myself out of my current circumstances.
Physician, heal yourself. That's, I know a lot of pastors. I know some individuals with, and again, this is going to lose some of you, but I can't help that. I know some individuals that have astounding gifts of healing, miraculous healing, and prayer, which means that when they pray, there's power there and things happen. But I've also noticed that many times in their lives, they can heal others, they can't heal themselves. It's part of that dynamic. C.S. Lewis is an interesting case, because with Joy Davidman, he prayed for her, and I've seen this with others too. Her pain transferred onto him, and he bore her pain for her for a while. That afforded the two of them, now he was stronger, because she was fighting cancer, afforded the two of them a real respite of joy. And so there's an interesting substitutionary quality perhaps going on with Jordan and his audience that's, in very Pageauian terms, laying itself out.
So,
well,
or even to make sense of them.
Yeah. I think that the role that you've played is a kind of a transition role, and that transition manifests itself to you as a trying to have your feet on two sides of rifting of two islands that are floating away from each other.
Now, again, if you listen to Pageau, talk to Rationality Rules and others, we're always using these spatial metaphors. And I think Pageau, he's an artist. He deals in physicality more than I do as a pastor. I'm a gospel word gardener of the age to come. But Pageau deals in matter more than I do. And I think what Pageau said is there. And modernity, modernity is receding. Now I get, comments on Twitter and in the comment section on this, and I fully understand that modernity is a continent, okay? And aspects recede while other aspects endure. You see this in Christianity. The Orthodox are still around, and then the Roman Catholic, the Latin, and then the medieval, and then the Protestant. I mean, there's layers here like sedimentation, and so the layers don't necessarily go away. They get subsumed. I mean, that's part of what happens in here. But I think Pageau is right, and on the tweet of the let's see, my channel. Hi, this is Paul. Yeah. On the video that I made, on the tweet, I think it is very important. I wouldn't be spending all this time doing it. I wouldn't have devoted so much of my time to it if I didn't believe that what's happening with Jordan and Jonathan and others is in fact the cutting edge of one area of evolution in the culture and the church right now. I think Pageau is right.
And you're trying to hold on. You're trying to kind of help people focus on the middle and help people avoid radicalization and avoid falling into camps in a manner that will lead to God knows what. And
well, looky here, the video dropped. Woohoo! We can do commentary with video now.
Rifting of two islands that are floating away from each other.
I thought really the person who nailed the dynamic here that Pageau talks about, the two different islands moving away from each other, was Rationality Rules in this video right here.
I listen to YouTube videos, and in this specific case I listened to Destiny. And interestingly, he essentially voiced the criticism of Jordan Jesus smuggling, but in reference to politics.
The problem with what Jordan Peterson does is Jordan Peterson makes a lot of descriptive claims, but he never makes any normative claims. So Jordan Peterson will say things like, women are not as happy today as they used to be, women and men don't get along in the office, men tend to be better at this thing.
It's a little ironic for the rationality science camp to have a problem with descriptive claims. And that Peterson keeps being very careful with his language, keeps to his descriptive claims, and doesn't keep sinking down into normative claims when they're really upset with the fact that, well, normative claims, but others are jumping to the normative claims conclusion, which is exactly their point right here.
And then that's all he ever says. He never takes a step further to make a prescriptive claim to say, like, what should we do about something? And the problem is a lot of people will take the things that he says and then they jump to very bad places. Kind of obviously, it's where you would expect someone to go based on what he said. But
very bad places, of course. Own your own value judgment.
But then he never takes responsibility for any of the kind of normative leaps people make off of his descriptive ones. And that's kind of the...
Why should he take responsibility for the normative leaps other people make off of his descriptive ones? That's like saying science should take responsibility for what people do with the science. And again, if you're in sort of this world of objects frame, how can you blame science? It just is. It's not an agent by virtue of covering one eye. So
the annoying thing with dealing with Jordan Peterson.
And here, Destiny is, as he often is, bang on the money. Jordan doesn't necessarily smuggle bad ideas himself, but he facilitates an environment that makes it incredibly easy for others to do so.
He offers the facts that led to facts that let other people jump to the conclusions that these people don't like.
He doesn't say that women should fulfill the role of looking after children, but he does clear the path for those who do. Given this, the question is how...
Which again, the irony is that, well, we're all about facts. Well, here's the facts. Women are not necessarily fulfilled by their career. This shouldn't come to a surprise to many men, because many men I know aren't terribly fulfilled by their careers either. Careers may not be terribly fulfilling. Shh, don't let anybody know. Then we'll stop keeping their nose to the grindstone with all of the invisible chains that we have for them.
How responsible is Jordan for the damage done by his rhetoric? How much responsibility is on the cross on his back? Truth be told, I don't know. I'd like to know your thoughts, so you can let.
And, in a sense, it's the Charles Murray thing too. Charles Murray keeps asking inconvenient questions, but if you're really down for science, the whole point of science is inconvenient questions. Again, this has sort of become a go-to video for understanding exactly how Jordan is playing here. And so now here Jonathan says, part of your, and I think Pageau is exactly right here, part of your tension right here is because you've got to let go of one of the sides. But part of the function that Jordan is playing is that he's being a bridge for people to go over, which is exactly the critique that he's getting from Rationality, Rules, and Destiny. Every now and then with my new process, I just making my video, commenting on, and I didn't hit record, and just 20 minutes of commentary I didn't get. So sorry, that's not a first draft on this. It'll be a little bit of a second draft when we start talking about Jordan Peterson and the conscience, and part of why I never preach the same sermon twice is I get bored hearing myself say the same thing over and over again, and so I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to be giving you. It is really a sad moment when I realize I just made 20 minutes of video without recording it. So I just took a little break, got up, walked around, read the comments from the little beginning of this video that I placed. So now you'll get second thoughts, not exactly the first thoughts. So again, Pageau, see, now I don't exactly know what I said before, so pardon me if I repeat. Pageau is rightly noting, and Pageau has noted this more than just about anybody else, that we are in a major transition point. And modernity is going away. And Peterson is a transitional figure. And as Destiny and Rationality Rules noted, Peterson is sort of laying down and everyone is walking on his back over the bridge. And as the lands get further and further away, Peterson's going to get stretched and stretched and stretched, and people are going to keep walking on his back. That's sort of the image of how this is going.
Trying to have your feet on two sides of rifting of two islands that are floating away from each other, and you're trying to hold on. You're trying to kind of help.
And Peterson, again, I don't know if I said this in the part that I didn't record. This is why I think Peterson is used by God in this. And this is part of the reason I don't know if or when Peterson himself will migrate. And if he migrates, he'll have to do in his actions. He will have to, in a sense, make the leap of faith. He will have to leap from one island to the next. But, well, I don't know, maybe via YouTube, it'll be documented. Part of the reason, sometimes when I think about my videos from 2-3 years ago, I want to take them down. I'm not going to take them down because I want to offer the markers on the trail that I took. And so if someone looks back 2-3 years, biographies do this all the time, 2-3 years, say, well, Paul Vanderklay was here. Now Paul Vanderklay's there. And now some of you might notice, well, he's still at Living Stones. He's still a CRC minister. In fact, the beliefs to which I subscribe, the fundamental ones, I guess I'm a fundamentalist now. The beliefs to which I subscribe, I am more convinced of, including the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ. If there's anything that this journey along the this is what I did say and what I didn't. If there's anything along this journey that has convinced me, and Pageau hits this hard in this conversation, it's the necessity of the physicality of Jesus Christ and the physicality of his resurrection. Because somebody's coming in at 2, and someone drove up from Southern California yesterday and wanted to meet with me, and I was, Sunday's not a good day necessarily to meet with me because I've got Sunday. Sunday's a big day for a pastor. We only work one day a week after all. Anyway, should stop distracting myself. Peterson, what did he write about in Maps of Meaning? You have to locate yourself. The whole point of doing what is meaningful and not what's expedience is that you have to locate yourself right there on the border of order and chaos. That's the optimal place. And so Peterson, for decades, has been trying to locate himself at the optimal place, and now he's there, and it's costing him everything. That is the story of Christ, okay? He goes to the optimal place. He waits until he's 30. 30 basically is the age at which in first century Judaism you could start your priesthood, okay? So why does Jesus wait till 30? Because, Ezekiel had the same passage. Ezekiel gets taken into captivity and then hits his 30th birthday when he's in captivity and he can't fulfill his priestly duties to the temple. That's Ezekiel. Christ turns 30 and now he's optimally at that point to have this happen. And what it means is his crucifixion. So Jordan, all of this stuff about orienting yourself in order and chaos, you're doing it, and now in a sense, and this is where it's going to get in later in the video, now in the sense, did you think it was just going to make you happy? If Jesus is in fact the ideal man, and he's crucified, there in the story it tells you what will happen to the ideal. And Jesus says that to his disciples. They will hate you like they hated me. And Jesus gets hated by all sides.
People focus on the middle and help people avoid radicalization and avoid falling into camps in a manner that will lead to God knows what. And so I think that that's the role that you played. And it's been like, I've seen, for example, people transition through your work, transition from worlds, moving.
Look at all of why do I do randos conversations? This is why I do it.
Worlds. That's really what I've seen happen. It's more than just changing your opinion or changing your mind about something. It really is about changing the world you inhabit. And so that's
key with Pageau's attentionality in terms of how Pageau sees the world, in terms of consciousness and, what a chair is, which you'll go into quite a bit later.
That's a crazy role to play. And especially because, like I said, you have your foot. It's like you kind of have your one foot or one eye, let's say, looking towards, I would call religion, or looking towards Christianity or something like that. And then you have another eye, which is still very much immersed in a kind of secular humanism. And you have one leg that is, you understand people that are more left-leaning. You understand people that are more right-leaning. You have this capacity to kind of understand everybody, but that means that you make enemies on all sides too.
And again, back to the story of Christ. My sermon on Sunday. I know most of you, I put my rough drafts on this channel. I don't put my sermons on this channel for a whole variety of reasons. But this is exactly the story of Christ. And so Peterson, here's the ideal man. Well, this ideal has been transmitted to you through Western civilization. Read Dominion. I should probably get a hard copy of Dominion just to put on my shelf here. Come on, Tom, mail me one. Who's the American publisher? I should just buy one. Like I buy all these books. Penguin never sent me an advance copy of Beyond Order. Who's going to talk about this book more than me? Come on, publishers. What's with you? Anyway, at least the little Christian publishers know who I am. Anyway, stop distracting yourself, Andrew Clay. Jordan's whole thing, chaos and order. Orient yourself optimally right there at the frontier between them. Jordan, this is how I want to organize my life. Boom, 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 boom. Now you're there. Okay. It's hurting like hell and it's killing you. And a little bit later, Pageau's going to say, well, you don't have a community. And it's not just and your fan base isn't really enough of a community. And it's not even that and it's not enough of a community. It's that you don't have a pastor. You don't have the practices. You don't have all of what it takes to be in the middle of a community that is actually doing this together. I mean, all of these things come up in this video, and it's the guy's coming at 2:00 and it's 10 minutes to 12. And so I know I'm not going to get through this, but that's the point of this, that Jordan has sort of done this by himself and put himself right there. He's seen enough of the way the world is via, natural revelation. He has figured out this puzzle. He has figured it out to an amazing extent via natural revelation and taking a look at special revelation. I'm using these theological categories from my own theological tradition. And he has figured this stuff out. And he says, this is where to live optimally, but he is not living in the church, both in terms of the network of relationships that you have in a church or the practices that you develop in a church. And so in that sense, he doesn't have the covering. And so he has, and I mentioned I think it's in Infinity Wars, where there's this really interesting scene that really popped in my head when Thor is making the new weapon, and it's like the full force of a sun has to go through Thor. He has to hold these two sides together. I've just got my little window here. I gotta hold the two sides together. In a sense, Peterson puts himself right there, and yeah, it's killing you, Jordan. Why? Well, because the dwarf hasn't locked you in the thing. You're just floating out there in space, and the gravity of the sun and the chaos of the open sea, rather than an estuary, is just gonna, the currents are just gonna throw you around. I mean, again, it's easy to hear Pageau and to think, oh, he wants to make him a Christian because this is a tribal thing. Okay. Fair enough. All those things are true. But you can make a pretty good argument that Jordan out at sea, this is killing him. It's killing him because he doesn't have the practices of the tradition. He doesn't have the covering of the tradition. And, I think about, because there's a certain people in this corner of YouTube are always concerned that they're going to take away his channel, and maybe they'll take away Jordan's channel at some point. That all could happen. But I'm in a church. I'm in that community. And in a sense, Weinstein is looking for FU money and enough of a platform. He doesn't have anywhere near as much of either as Jordan does, and Jordan can still get rolled. But in a sense, what you have when you're in the church is, now you're in the body of Christ. This is something that the world has to contend with. And Jordan is just out there going it alone. Okay, because I just watched all this 20 minutes ago, I know what's coming pretty easily. We're about to talk about conscience, and conscience can be mapped onto psychologically, mapped onto developmentally, mapped onto from below, let's say. But this is where I get into my God number one and my resistance to sort of this Cartesian spiritual substantiality, substantism. And conscience is experienced psychologically, of course, and psychologically it has everything to do with the first draft mapped on into us from our parents and our community, and conscience is what guides us within the community. And so might as well just play the darn thing.
Well, the overwhelming response that I've got publicly has been, I would say, traumatically positive.
Yeah.
And when I heard that on the podcast, was it traumatically or dramatically? And at least now here with the video, I can read his lips. It's traumatically positive. And that's right. So your fandom is around you, and that maybe keeps you from getting rolled, but not throughout history.
And you wouldn't think that would be possible, really, but I find it that way. I mean, partly it's overwhelming to have people constantly tell me in person their responses to what I've been doing. It's very emotional, and I get caught up in that quite quickly. And of course, on YouTube and the social media platforms, YouTube particularly, the bulk of the comments about me are very, very positive. It's 99-1 often in terms of likes and dislikes. And it's too much. Well, I don't know how to.
Well, and this is where he's lacking. To use Pageau, Pentecostals and Jonathan Pageau both use this language of covering, which is very interesting, because again, Jordan's just sort of out there in a boat on his own, and he doesn't have the buffer of a church around him. I mean, for me, instinctively, to have a meetup group, to connect myself quite deeply with Bridges of Meaning, Discord server, and that community, and an estuary. I know from the practice of the church you need a harbor, and that harbor is made up by people around you. And part of what, it's very interesting because Jordan has even seemed lately to sort of double down on Peterson Inc. And now, did I say this in the part of the video I recorded, or sorry if I'm repeating myself, but he doesn't have that community around him, and so he has to default to his personal relationships and his familial relationships, because he doesn't have that other layer that myself as a pastor that I have. To a degree he had the academy, but the academy was pointing in another direction, so he lost that. He doesn't have the practice of a clinical psychologist anymore. That's been destroyed. And so again, in some ways, Jordan has been sort of this navigator out there who doesn't go with a fleet.
I don't know what category to put it in. I don't know how to conceptualize it. I mean, part of me, the practical part, of course, says, well, I just happened to adopt a new technology at a time when it started to boom and filled a kind of niche that was empty in that technology at that time. But well,
that's not exactly true. He's a little late to the YouTube game. YouTube had boomed before. I think he showed me a different way of using it.
In some sense, that doesn't really cut it, because it doesn't have anything to do with the content. And then I think, well, I have been dealing with these, borderline religious issues. Well, certainly not just borderline. There's lots of religious people who seem to think that I'm dealing with religious issues. And that's really what I wanted to talk to you about tonight. So this book I mentioned
18 and a half minutes. We're still in the introduction. Gotta love it.
Earlier, talked about disagreements with my conceptualization of Christ, let's say, and I'm not sure what that conceptualization is, by the way, exactly. It's a mystery to me. But I can say some concrete things about it. I mean, I understand and appreciate the symbolic significance of the ideal human being. And that finds its embodiment. And I took these ideas in large part from Jung and Erich Neumann, that Christ is at least a representation of the ideal man, whatever that is. And we all, interestingly enough, we all seem to have an ideal.
Now, again, so Peterson, in a sense, the Jordan Peterson story is a quite remarkable story of someone who seeks to go it alone. I've been doing a lot of pondering lately on the institutionality of Western civilization and the church, because in many ways the church, what happens in the Protestant Reformation, and especially what happens in the 19th and 20th century, especially in the 20th century, is the church sort of busts out of its walls. And, Pageau points out that, religiosity is going to happen. And so people are going to do it in the wake of George Floyd, and they're going to do it on the steps of the Capitol, because it's busted out of the church. And part of that is because the church hasn't done well. The church hasn't done as it's supposed to. And so Peterson is sort of, this lone wolf out there doing it on his own, and embracing Christ as the ideal man and trying to embody him without the church. Now, that is deeply, I don't know if it's Canadian or not, it certainly is American. We saw that in many of the 19th century millenarian movements, the rise of the Jehovah's Witnesses, the rise of the Seventh-day Adventists, the rise of the Latter-day Saints. And this happened in New York State's burned over district. And so in a sense, Peterson is doing this. And to go back to Douthat's conversation with Tara Burton and Stephen Smith, that video that I played quite a while ago, what was that woman's name who ran for president for a while for the Democrats? They made the observation that if she were alive in the 19th century, she would have started a church. And Jordan started his own little church so he could marry people. And he wanted to buy a church building. But now, instead of a church building, you have YouTube. And that rings home and connects with me because, of course, I'm right at that cusp. And again, one of the videos that isn't going to get made today, I got some sermon evaluation from a member of the congregation, which happens remarkably little. I get much more feedback on my rough drafts than I ever do in church. That says something about the dysfunctionality of the church. And I was thinking, to what degree is YouTube and the Discord server and all of these conversations that I'm having, these other instruments that are just sort of in the twilight of institutionality? Look at this with Word on Fire, let's say. And this book that Peterson is thinking about is from these people from Word on Fire. Now, Word on Fire is within the Roman Catholic Church. And the Roman Catholic Church, with the conventicles and the Knights of Columbus, and the Roman Catholic Church has managed to have all of these tiny little, the orders, all of these things sort of within the massive tent that is the church. Protestantism, of course, has done it lots of different ways. Protestantism is just some sort of massive experiment in the West. And then how Orthodoxy will enter into this very dynamic context is going to be something interesting to watch. But then here's Peterson, and he, again, via sort of natural revelation, figures out kind of the optimal place to be. And he uses, that's interesting too. This is all just thinking out loud, obviously. That's what my channel is. So you've got the academy, which of course is a daughter of the church. You've got therapy, which is of course at least next door to the church. I had that question Friday about it from James and did some reflecting on my channel. And then now you've got YouTube, which is very Protestant churchness. Peterson has in some ways replicated a church in a deeply Protestant way. I've mentioned this back in videos a while ago before his hiatus. There was something deeply Protestant about Jordan. And, a little bit later, towards the end of the video, he and Pageau will talk about, Pageau is one of the few people that has seen Jordan in church, and this came up. Tammy's mentioned it before too, where he can't sit still, and I get that. But I am the son of a Christian Reformed minister, and I had a Frisian mother sitting next to me, enforcing sitting still in the pew at Northside Chapel in Patterson. Check that off your bingo card. Under threat of corporal punishment every Sunday. So I was trained to sit still in church. And maybe the reason I preach, and Rick always complains because I dance on stage, I don't really dance, but I don't stay in the little box Rick's is trying to stream me out to the world in, is because I got up on stage because that's the one place in church I didn't have to sit still. They say, Paul, you're going to the wrong church. Go to the black church. Go to a Pentecostal church. Go to a Holy Roller church. There's other parts of me too. But Jordan has in some ways, in a very Protestant way, created church. And if you think about it in terms of what he's been able to figure out via psychology, natural revelation, understanding the Bible, boy, I'm really going to have to think about that. Mary called me a big furry tease in the comment section because I only gave a little 20-minute introduction. So I just uploaded a part 1 for this because I got to a point and I got so possessed by trying to figure out the relationship between the institutionalized church and the Jordan Peterson moment. I just had to stop making video. So I uploaded it, and maybe I'll record it. Maybe I'll release it because, again, I got a guy coming in an hour and a half, and I got to talk to him, and I've got classes tomorrow. And, where's the coordination here? If you drop a video like this, it's going to be hours for me to digest this thing. And I've got my call to my family on my Monday evening because I got to continue to support my mom and my sister and my brother-in-law. And, never a convenient time for something this major to drop. So, okay. So Jordan's going to talk about the Roman Catholics and his biblical series, which again is a fair thing. And I did that. I did that myself. I tend to think that part of the reason, this is the problem of not recording, thinking I'm recording and not recording, because I remember saying these things, but I don't know if they're in the recorded part or the missed part. Part of the reason I did my commentary on the Jordan Peterson biblical series on YouTube was because the series itself was on YouTube. And that doesn't mean that other ways are illegitimate. They're just a little alien in some ways. And so to critique, and I did plenty of this too, to critique Jordan against sort of the stated knowledge that the church has about the Bible, and Jordan being not a biblical scholar at all, no training in Greek or Hebrew, and using Bible Hub, you're gonna rightly sort of compare the static versions of it. But I think what Pageau was saying in terms of the movement of Jordan, in terms of these two islands, is foundational in terms of this whole project of what Jordan's doing.
So this book I mentioned earlier talked about disagreements with my conceptualization of Christ, let's say, and I'm not sure what that conceptualization is, by the way, exactly. It's a mystery to me, but I can say some concrete things about it. I mean, I understand and appreciate the symbolic significance of the ideal human being, and that finds its embodiment. And I took these ideas in large part from Jung and Erich Neumann, that Christ is at least a representation of the ideal man, whatever that is. And we all, interestingly enough, we all seem to have an ideal, and that ideal has us, right? And that's where it's very interesting.
And yes, the ideal has us. The ideal it's kind of like enforced monogamy. And this is where you get into the conscience too, that it does have us. We have it and it has us. The membranes of us and our context are very porous.
To consider the role of conscience, because your conscience will call you out on your behavior. And so it seems to function as something that's somewhat independent, or at least as something that you can't fully voluntarily control. Because if you could voluntarily control it, then you just tell the pesky little bastard to go away.
Okay, now let's talk about social media, but because I know I didn't record this and I talked about this and it was something that I thought of when I was thinking about it. Part of how social media is so corrosive to our consciences is because in some ways it permits us to construct a false conscience, which is an echo chamber, which sort of diminishes our consciences, okay? How do I get at that? Well, think about what a conscience is. Now, again, I'm pushing back against Cartesian dualist substantism. All right? Cartesian dualist substantism imagines we have to conceptualize spirituality as substance rather than, let's say, spirituality as the thing that makes the chair out of stumps and bean bags. All right? Because Pageau's going to talk about chair, and they're going to talk about there. I think this is a big part of what happened with deism and materialism in terms of getting our mapping going the wrong way. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone after the rise of modern psychology that conscience is formed by parents, by churches, by peers, by culture. Conscience is part of that first draft. It's a sense, I mean, Jiminy Cricket, Pinocchio, Jiminy Cricket, JC, get it? Is the agentification of that whole thing. All right? So we can think about it in those kinds of terms. And as I said, we're talking very much God number one here. What is God number one? People rightly, well, you should have a definitive video on God number one and God number two. The problem is, as I've said many times, God number one and God number two are like two little plastic buckets on a workbench. I throw things in different ones, and sometimes I move them around. And no, I am not mapping them onto the Trinity, because these are two different conceptualizations than the Trinity. The Trinity is three persons, so they're all in there God number two, but they're not without God number one. Right now, my latest conceptualization of God number one and God number two is God number one as arenic, God number two as agentic. And it is the... if you look at, if you look at what the Hebrews figured out with respect to God, and how the Hebrew God displaces and transcends the polytheistic God, not necessarily evolutionarily. The source, it's not either or, and we get into all of these issues after deism with respect to God and agency, and I bump up to those issues all the time when I mention I'm a Calvinist, because almost all of the tripping that happens with the folk religion perspective on Calvinism has everything to do with these knotty issues of agency. So is conscience crowdsourced? Yes. Is conscience instilled in us by our parents? Yes. Is conscience seep into us from our culture? Yes. Why would we call this from God? Well, God number one.
Or to pat you on the back continually, because there must, or to control it. They can't fully voluntarily control, because if you could voluntarily control it, then you just tell the pesky little bastard to go away, or to pat you on the back continually, because there must be few things in life more pleasurable than being a fully committed narcissist.
Probably not, but I understand your point.
To really believe that everything that you do is right and that you're a good person.
Because the thing about the narcissist or the psychopath is that although they haven't, think about it this way. A narcissist, or especially a psychopath, has failed to adequately internalize. They have not mapped out. They have not created that first draft internal, and that first draft doesn't have voice within them to speak. They lack Jiminy Cricket. And that, as Peterson is about to say, how do I know what he's about to say? It's because I've watched it how many times already. What he's about to say is that you're going to struggle in the world with all of the other agents, all of that mapping. To be a psychopath is a disability. To be a narcissist is a disability. In the long run, it will fail you because you cannot mind read and take on the signals and the symbols that allow you to work productively in society and the group around you. It won't allow you to mind read the room, okay? Because the room has a mind, your community has a mind, and all of that mapping and all of that conscience helps you to mind read the room.
And I suppose if you could wave a magic wand and rearrange your mind so that it was constantly telling you that, you do it, but you don't.
Well, that's exactly what we're doing with social media. We're now with social media, we have the power to, in a way, alter the mind in the room. Except it's going to go bad for you, and it's going to make you depressed, as studies have shown social media does. It's going to inhibit your capacity to actually relate to real people in real time. And so, I'm worried about the younger generations that have been so taken by that platform.
Seem to be able to do that in relationship to your conscience. It trips you up. And so it tells you when you're not living up to your own ideal. And
it does that so that you can actually function in the world.
Means that you have an ideal and you don't even know what the hell it is, but you certainly know when you transgress against it. And I know that there's a strong line of Christian thinking that's identified the conscience with divinity, sometimes with Christ inside, sometimes with the Holy Spirit. And those are very interesting conceptualizations, but you can think of them psychologically.
And what he says, that's exactly right. And as a pastor, it's the still small voice. I have a friend who, this is a funny guy. It's the little voice. I listened to the little voice and I gave him the Jesus sign. And some of you who watch the Freddie and Paul show know who exactly I'm talking about. But that's it. It's been conceptualized in there. Now, again, because of the Cartesian substantism dualism that we have sort of embodied in the church, for me to talk that way, it makes a lot of people more on the fundamentalist side a little bit nervous. But again, the God of creation is the God of redemption. They're the same God. God number one and God number two are the same God. It's just that God number one and God number two are so deeply linked that when your conscience is speaking to you, well, that's the agentic aspect of God. And the arenic aspect of God is the imprint that has been put into you. Now, again, I am not, see, the further I understand Pageau and the more I'm able to actually manage his language, the more often certain groups are going to mishear me, just like Rationality Rules did to Jonathan Pageau in his crying game moment. But that's the journey we're on now. And, the video that I didn't make, one of the videos I didn't make is, so if you continue to go down the Jordan Peterson road and you continue to optimize and get better at that moment of truth, which is right there, sort of where chaos and error, chaos and order, that really productive middle space that Jordan likes to talk about, you really get good at that, you are going to increasingly find yourself alone. Now, in the church, you have the benefit that I can at least, if I get closer and closer to Christ, and I don't mean that sort of in the I don't mean that only in the pietistic way, because the piety language is trying to get at that. But when I get closer and closer to acting like Christ, even in the church, I will get more and more alone, but at least I have Christ with me. How? Because I can point to his words and I'll say, see, that was his position. That's mine too. And in the church, if you get sideways with Jesus, there are going to be issues. And so Peterson doesn't have any of that here. And so that's I think a big part of what's going on with him. All he's got is his conscience.
You can even think about them biologically, to some degree, because we're so social. If we don't manifest an appropriate moral reciprocity, we're going to become alienated from our fellows, and we won't survive, and we'll suffer and die, and we certainly won't find a partner and have children successfully. And so
there it is. There's the agentic and the erenic right there. You have to sufficiently internalize it so that it is a voice in your head. Well, is that the voice of God? Yes. And sometimes no. And no, but sometimes yes. And so when you say, Rod Dreher out on his blog, that's another book I got to get my hands on. Lerman, who did When God Talks Back, when she, as an anthropologist, embedded herself in a vineyard church. That was an excellent book, came out a number of years ago. She's written another book now, and she's basically barking up the same tree. And I get the question often as a pastor, well, how do I know that it's God and not me? And in some ways, the conceptualization of that is sort of, it has to be, you have to have the antithetical. And this is the way that, after I had to lament the loss of 20 minutes of recording, I went and I read comments and got into theosis a little bit in the comments from the thing I posted. That's the Protestant but to theosis language. I am moving towards being in Christ. I am moving towards being godly. That's another very common pietistic language for theosis. I am taking on, I am his witness. There's another one. There's all of these things that get at that idea. I am not infallible. I am very fallible. And my capacity, whether it is to, and I thought about this years ago, whether it is to read the words in the Bible or to listen to the still small voice, I am fallible. That's one of the things that Calvinism beats into you. You are fallible. Don't you forget it. At the same time, God does work through me. And in the Question and Answer Friday, I talked about John Calvin's commentary to the book of Genesis, where he comments on, and I've actually read it on the channel a couple of years ago, he comments on Jacob fighting with God and how God sort of, with one hand he fights him, with the other hand he supports Jacob, because Jacob could not fight with God unless God was giving Jacob the strength to fight with him. This stuff gets really weird for us in our individualistic, materialistic world where we just sort of imagine our boundaries are our skin. All right, I just sent that out into the part one out into the world. I'm probably going to combine them all because, again, I've got a 2 o'clock appointment. I'll combine them all and probably release them along with this tomorrow morning. Maybe I'll put that little stamp in so people can see exactly where to start if they don't want to rewatch the first commentary on them. And when I post them to YouTube without a delay, it puts ads all through whenever it gets, and then I have to go back later and pull the ads out so sorry in advance for all the ads. If you get YouTube Premium, then you don't, but then you got to give money to Google, but you're using Google anyway, so work that out as you will.
To some degree, the conscience can be viewed as the voice of reciprocal society within, and that's a perfectly reasonable biological explanation.
The voice of reciprocal society from within. That's pretty much my first draft idea. I think that's exactly right.
But the thing is the deeper you go into biology, the more it shades into something that appears to be religious, because you start analyzing the fundamental structure of the psyche itself.
Now, this gets really interesting because, let's see. So Clubhouse is a thing. I've not sought an invitation. I've not downloaded the app. I've not done anything to get on it. And although some people are saying, Clubhouse is a pretty good platform, I don't know how many more platforms I can handle. But Brett Weinstein was in this conversation, and this has been now posted up to YouTube. And what was really interesting was sort of the conflation of evolutionary biology with eugenics.
Not within your capacity because you feel like he and how they want to be identified.
Biologist. I'm very interested in how, let me just say, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I'm very interested in how language actually changes. Say again?
A eugenicist. That's what you mean as evolution.
No.
Those are the same thing.
No, it's not the same
thing.
thing.
They are the
it's
same.
Not. It's not the same thing. In fact, one of my
argue that here. You're not about to try to wiggle out of that.
I'm not trying to wiggle out of anything.
For eugenicists. Yes,
I'm not trying to wiggle out of anything. Look.
Now, that little thing about her calling him a eugenicist because he's an evolutionary biologist. Well, what he's about to say right now?
Racism and genocide are products of evolution. I don't favor them. I recognize that they emerge out of evolution, and part of what I want to do is help people to understand why that is and what we can do about it.
And this is where Sam in the Discord server made the comment once, which I think he's exactly right, and he picked up on it, sort of the default Gnosticism within Brett Weinstein's position that, well, racism and genocide are part of evolutionary biology, and we are trying to transcend it. Well, where do we get the normative platform from which to critique the natural process? Where's Tom Holland when we need him? And so, okay, conscience. Well, how has all of this developed? Where has this all come from?
And it becomes something. Well, it becomes something with a power that transcends your ability to resist it.
So this is interesting because basically I would love to hear Jordan and Brett talk about this. Because what Jordan is saying is that if you go deep enough in biology, you're going to find something that isn't natural to evolutionary biology. And these people that were beating up poor Brett in Clubhouse, it's like, Clubhouse looks like torture chamber. These people that are beating up poor Brett in the Clubhouse are in some ways in their attacking bearing witness to the fact that there is a morality that Brett is smuggling in. Because that morality is not found in evolution. And so in a sense, they're saying you're a eugenicist. Well, why would Brett Weinstein be a eugenicist? Well, because he is colonizing, this is what eugenics is. You colonize the tools of evolutionary biology in order to achieve an outcome that you believe is good. Boy, I'm not going to get anywhere near done this video today. Oh, and I've got classes tomorrow. I got a chair classes, so it's not like I can just, keep classes on over there. I'm going to be highly motivated tomorrow to move my classes meeting along so I can get back to this video. I got a lot of stuff I got to do. I got to look at my calendar. Crap. Anyway. What is the implicit eugenicism beneath Brett Weinstein's project? Well, he is adding a conscience. That's basically what he's saying. He's adding a conscience. But he's colonizing. There's another video I wanted to do. Parasitism and colonization. He's colonizing nature. And, again, read C.S. Lewis's Miracles. Where does this reason that he's using to colonize come from?
So you can think about Christ from a psychological perspective, and the critic, my critic, this particular critic that I've been reading, said, well, that doesn't differentiate Christ much from a whole sequence of dying and resurrecting mythological gods. And of course, people have made that claim in comparative religion. Joseph Campbell did that, and Jung to a lesser degree, I would say, but Campbell did that. But difference, and C.S. Lewis pointed this out as well, the difference between those mythological gods and Christ was that there's a representation of, there's a historical representation of his existence as well. Now you can debate whether or not that's genuine. You can debate about whether or not he actually lived and whether there's credible objective evidence for that. But
now, if you go back to my videos that I've been doing about Tom Holland and history, okay, so this is after one of these Barfieldian divides here, where we've got a separation between wind and spirit, where we've got a separation between the story and the matterverse and the storyverse. And so there's tension between them. And again, one of the deep underlying elements of this conversation that Peterson will get into will be, well, what if they're actually connected? Well, we know they're connected via human ideation, but what if they're connected? What if our connection via human ideation is actually a revelation or a sacrament or a portal to a much deeper connection beneath them? And I think this is what sort of Peterson and Pageau have always been doing. And this is sort of the frontier of postmodernity says there is, but in a materialist frame. And these others are looking for it in a much deeper frame.
it doesn't matter in some sense because this, well, it does, but there's a sense in which it doesn't matter because there's still a historical story. And so what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived plus a myth. And in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that, but I don't know. I'm amazed at my own belief and I don't understand it. Like, because I've seen sometimes the objective world and the narrative world touch. You know, that's Jungian synchronicity. Yeah. And I've seen that many times in my own life. And so in some sense, I believe it's undeniable. You know, we have a narrative sense of the world. For me, that's been the world of morality. That's the world that tells us how to act. It's real. Like, we treat it like it's real. It's not the objective world. But the narrative and the objective world touch. And
it's not the physical world.
The ultimate example of that, in principle, is supposed to be Christ. But I don't know what to... that seems to me...
I started making videos because I wanted Jordan Peterson to read C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, because that is what this is what miracles is about, how they touch. And where Pageau goes in terms of going all the way down to the bottom and pulling it up again, that's the grand miracle.
Oddly plausible.
Yeah.
But I still don't know what to make of it. It's partly because it's too terrifying a reality to fully believe. I don't even know what would happen to you if you fully believed it.
If you believed in the story of Christ, or if you believed that history and let's say the narrative meet, let's
both,
say.
I think you, because when you believe that, you buy both those stories. You believe that the narrative and the objective can actually touch.
Yeah.
I mean,
not only touch, but one is governing the other. Isn't that what's behind the Jedi? Isn't that what's behind Harry Potter? Isn't that what's behind magic and technology? Technology is basically our figuring out how to colonize the physical verse, the physical universe, the matterverse from the storyverse. That's what we're doing.
We saw that, you and I mean, this is a trivial example, but when we were discussing, we had a sequence of discussions around frog symbolism 4 years ago.
Yeah.
That was very bizarre, to say the least. You know, and that was a trivial example, relatively trivial example of the narrative world and the objective world coming together. Didn't feel that trivial at the time.
Well, the way that I like to deal with this is that one of the things, it's already there in your thought. It's already there in the way that you talk about reality, which is that.
And I think that is exactly, I didn't know it consciously, But my relevance realizers in my consciousness Congress, when I first listened to Jordan Peterson, said, pay attention to him. Like, why? Just keep watching.
That one of the constitutive aspects of how reality unfolds and how it appears to us is something like attention, right? It's something, there's a hierarchy of manifestation, because everything that appears to us in the world has an infinite amount of details, right? It has an indefinite amount of ways that you could describe it, that you could, angles that, by which you could analyze it. And so nonetheless, the world appears to us through these hierarchies of meaning, right? I always kind of use the example of a cup or a chair. Like a chair is just a multitude of things. It's a multitude of parts. How is it that we can say that it's one thing? There's a capacity we have to attend, and this capacity we have to attend is something like a co-creation of the world. And so the world actually exists.
Well, a chair is a good example because, you can try to define it objectively, but you end up with beanbags and stumps, and
exactly,
and they don't have anything in common. Well, they're both made of matter, for whatever that's worth. It's pretty trivial level of commonality, but you can sit on them.
Yeah,
and that's what unites
there's a
them.
mode of being which defines them.
Well, and that's so strange. So many of our object perceptions are projected modes of being.
And again, look at all of the Vervaeke stuff on this, because Vervaeke walks through that stuff in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis.
And so even the objective world is ineluctably contaminated with its utility, and therefore with morality.
Exactly. And so I think that that's the key. The key is that once you understand that the world manifests itself through attention, and that consciousness has a place to play in actually the way in which the world reveals itself. And so you can try to posit a world outside of that first person perspective, but it's
good
kind
luck.
of diluted. It's a diluted activity.
Well, it's the monarchical vision. And what's interesting about our society is that, so I looked at that, I listened to some of that Clubhouse, the much longer part of the Clubhouse video. I mean, there's 5 hours of it out there. And one of the things that you see happening with standpoint epistemology is that they basically say it's just this little trick. My perspective is the perspective. Okay. But they sort of do it in a different new language, and it's got a culture around it that gives it legitimacy and force and fear, so that they're doing the trick. And it's like, once you see the trick a few times, it's like, oh, wait a minute, that's just a trick. But there it is.
Well, it's very, very difficult because you don't know what to make of something like time, because time has an ineradicably subjective element, and duration, which is different than time. I mean, time is kind of like the average rate at which things change, but duration is something like the felt sense of that time. And if you take away the subjectivity, it isn't obvious what to do with time. And I think physicists stumble over this all the time, so to speak. So, and this is something that this intermingling of value and fact was something that I never thought I made much traction with Harris.
Persig, Sevilla King.
With Sam Harris.
No, you didn't make any progress with Sam, because Sam wasn't going to listen. I mean, one of the first videos I made on that conversation was Jordan kept building something and Sam kept knocking it over. And part of this, another video I wanted to make was basically about status, because Jordan, poor little bucko, hasn't had much air lately. There, now he's doing better. Status. It's a big deal. But status binds and blinds, and Sam Harris gets to a certain point, and backing down from Jordan on stage won't be seemly. He'll let down his side. Same with atheists and Christians, but it's later on that you sort of, revert to the mean.
He didn't. This is something that this intermingling of value and fact was something that I never thought I made much traction with Harris, with Sam Harris. He didn't seem to me to be willing to admit how saturated the world of fact is inevitably with value. And I actually think he's denying the science at that point, because for everything I know about perceptual psychology, there's a great book called Vision as a... Oh God, now I can't remember the name of the book. That's memory trouble. I'll remember it.
No worries. The idea is that if that is true, then there are certain things which come out of that. There are certain necessary things down the road from that insight, which is that attention plays a part in the way the world lays itself out. And that one of them is that the stuff that the world is made of is partly something like attention, something like consciousness, and that has a pattern. And that pattern is the same pattern as stories. It doesn't lay itself out exactly.
Now, this is where the conversations with John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pageau and I usually wind up, because Jonathan or John Vervaeke has a point of, well, there are non-narrative elements, and if you sort of, and we exist as human beings before we're narratively equipped. And there are conscious beings, dogs and cats, rats, that don't appear to be narrative-based, but yet are conscious. And so I think it's sort of the anxiety that narrative is a ride on, and Jonathan and Jordan perhaps are pushing narrative too far. That's sort of where you get, I think, John Vervaeke's anxiety about the narrative language.
The same, something like attention, something like consciousness, and that has a pattern, and that pattern is the same pattern as stories. It doesn't lay itself out exactly the same, but things exist with a pattern which is similar to stories. They have identities, they have centers, they have margins, they have exceptions. And that's how stories lay themselves out. Like, so a story happens in time, how an identity, let's say, is broken down and then reconstructed. You could say that that's basically the story of every story, how something breaks down and is reconstructed. And so that is a way for us to perceive the identity of things. And so if the world is made of this, then...
Now, let me go back to this.
And so that is a way for us to perceive the identity of things.
That's a really interesting point, because right now in the modern, in the popular context, identity is everything. And Pageau quite rightly notes that identity is a function of the agent arena context. Identity is a function of how you present in the story. I have an identity as father within the family. I have identity of pastor within the church. I have identity of citizen within the nation. I have identity of, if I'm playing basketball, because I'm tall, maybe center within the team. This is how identity works, and the irony of sort of this folk, let's call it folk postmodernism. The irony of the folk postmodernism is it elevates identity while trying to overtly destroy story and smuggling story in under the radar, and so Jonathan's laying things out quite well here.
And so, if the world is made of this, then it's actually our world, our...
Now, when he says that,
secular... And so, if the world is made of this...
Right there. Okay, you got the two islands. When Jonathan says a sentence like that, he has jumped all the way on to the next island. Or perhaps the old island. Because we are dealing with Barfieldian participation here. Because almost everyone listening to this will have a moment of internal pause. What do you mean the world is made up of story? They're going to say, no, the world is made up of matter. And then Pageau will come back and say, is a chair matter? A chair isn't matter. It might be made up of stumps and beanbags and sticks and twigs and matter. But the chair is not in the matterverse. What do you mean? Well, no human constructed it. Well, you might find stumps that no human being actually cut the tree down and the tree fell of its own accord. But it becomes a chair by virtue of a human being. It's an agent-arena relationship. And what Pageau is saying is that's the world. And so you can see, Jonathan is fairly far along the path of phenomenology. Now, what's interesting again is to try to figure out. Pageau will often ask where you are, and in this case, maybe the better question is when are you, Jonathan? Because what's so interesting about Jonathan is he is ancient modern. Now, I first got acquainted with ancient modern when we were looking at liturgy in the late 90s, early aughts, as the seeker church movement was receding into the emergent church movement. And it's sort of where phenomenology and church fathers meet. And this is why it could be that whereas in modernity looks at the Middle Ages and calls them the Dark Ages, it could very well be that 500 years from now, they look back at the modern period and call it the Dark Ages. Why? If you look at Jonathan's brother's book, matter is dark. It's a chair cannot be found in nature. Yes and no. A chair can only be found in nature by an agent, because it's the agent that creates the chair, even if he's just sitting on a rock that has been there. That's how the rock becomes a chair. And it might have all kinds of constitutive elements, but as Jonathan notes, that's the world. In front of me are, patterns of atoms that I am looking at as computer screens, as a camera, as a microphone, as a light, as the rest of this messy office. But I am bringing all of that to this. And again, Vervaeke talks about that with grasping and all of the fancy Vervaeke terms.
Then it's actually our world, our secular world, which is a strange aberration on how reality used to exist for every culture in every time from the beginning of time, which is to take that for granted, that something that they didn't call it consciousness, but intelligence and attention are part of how the world lays itself out. And it lays itself out in modes of being. And one of the things that comes out of it is not only...
Now, modes of being. If you go back to my series that I'm doing of Jonathan's brother's book, one of the things that John Walton brings out are the ancient gods. What are the ancient gods? They're functional. Now, we tend to, again, think of them in terms of ontological, and I don't think we modernists can even use that word ontological without first being so deeply immersed in materiality. And so that's where Descartes is interesting, because there's sort of this substantism that, well, they have spiritual substance, not material substance. And I think, again, in the pictures in our mind, in our imagination, we just imagine something out of Ghostbusters like ectoplasm. And then the celebrity, the amazing Randy will raid right in and say, ha, no such thing. All there is matter and information. And again, Daniel Dennett, but I say, once you let in information, you've just given up the game as a materialist.
Only that, intelligence and attention are part of how the world lays itself out. And it lays itself out in modes of being. And one of the things that comes out of it is not only that, but like you said, it's not only that you have ideas, but it's that ideas have you, or that it's not only that you...
Ideas have you. Okay, what does that mean? That there's something above us and beyond us that, just like we make a chair out of a stump. Now, this is going to put on your woo helmet. The ideas have us. Just like I have a chair.
engage in modes of being. It's that modes of being have you. And that recognition means that the first level of the...
And listen to some of the people who participated in the Capitol riot and stormed the Capitol. What do they say? I was sort of swept away. What was doing the sweeping? I wasn't in control of myself. People who fall in love. Cupid shot his arrow. Aphrodite put me under her spell. It's all the same thing.
The first means that the first level of attention to that looks something like worship. It looks like celebration. It looks like it's like the thing which makes let's say the National Hockey League so successful has more to do with celebration than just a bunch of guys on skates on a piece of ice, throwing a puck around. There's a celebration of the purpose of that thing, and it manifests itself through a bunch of stuff, one is like a trophy that stands in the middle on the top of on a stand, and everybody looks at it and kisses it. And so there's this veneration, and
there's the spirit of the National Hockey League.
Mascots.
The Hockey League example is very interesting because it's a social game. And, all the players, they're attempting to aim right? So there's a symbolic element to that. Sin is misplaced aim.
Yep.
And so you hit the small space in the net, blocked though it may be by your enemies, and everyone celebrates that. And you do that in cooperation with other people and in competition with other people. And if you do it properly, not only are you a brilliant player from a technical perspective, but you're also a great sport. And so there's an ethic there and a morality. And this is why people are so upset when hockey players or any other pro athlete does something immoral in their personal life, is because it violates the ethic that's being celebrated as a consequence of this great game.
And look at cancel culture. Look at the celebrities who have done something wrong and they've been taken down, even though it doesn't impact how well they act. Or look at Ravi Zacharias and what happened to him and why why Christians are so upset and how this shakes the foundations. And yeah.
Yeah. And right. So you can see that the striving for an ideal mode of being, the religious striving for an ideal mode of being, is central to what it is that makes hockey addictive.
That's right. Yeah, necessarily. And so
God, I saw that in pro wrestling. There's a great documentary, Bret Hart, called Hitman Hart. It's one of the best documentaries I've ever seen. And it portrays pro wrestling as a stark religious battle between the forces of good and evil. And Bret Hart, who at one point was the most famous Canadian in the world, was overwhelmed by the archetypal force of his representation as the good guy.
Now, this is where, again, symbolism happens, religion happens, the institutional boundaries. Jordan often says this observation about Nietzsche, that what the church did was impose this discipline on Europe, and that discipline became a pressure cooker that really, maybe crafted a diamond or, purified gold or, something of this nature. And it's blown out. And in some ways that's connected to Charles Taylor's supernova that he writes about in The Secular Age. And I think that's, so people go to the church of pro wrestling. Pro wrestling lots of people have noted that pro wrestling is a morality tale. You have good guys and bad guys. It's the church of the spaghetti western. It's the church of... all of this religious stuff is just all over the map.
It's a great documentary, Hitman Hart. And it shows you how pro wrestling is it's not the world's most intellectual activity. to say the least, and people can easily be dismissive of it. But one of the things I loved about the documentary was that it attempted to understand from within what was compelling about what was being portrayed. And it was a religious drama. It just was shocking and brilliant.
And so that is actually, there's an objective part of that there's an objective way in which these patterns kind of come together and manifest, let's say,
There's an objective way. It's probably a better use of the word objective, but again, Pageau is so far over the line that a lot of people, I mean, some of the people like Adam Friended, who Adam was a very sympathetic conversation partner for Jonathan, but that word objective is so tied, and this is where we just have to be word gardeners.
higher and higher versions of this drama. And so the sports drama has a certain level, but it's limited to a certain extent because it still happens as a confrontation, let's say, between two irreducible sides. And so what happens in something like the story of Christ is that gets taken into one person. And so all the opposites become the king and the criminal, the highest. Even in the image of the cross, you have this image. And as Christ is being crucified, they're putting a sign above his head saying that he's the king. As Christ is being beaten, they're giving to him a crown. And so Christ joins together all the opposites. And so in his story, you see, if you're attentive to these patterns, you see the highest form of this pattern being played out. And one of the aspects that has to be there for it to be the most revealed or highest form is that it also has to include the world of manifestation. I mean, it can't just be a story. It has to be connected to the world.
It has to colonize the world. And, when Vervaeke first heard me using that word, I mean, that's become a dirty word. Where did I get it? I got it from Lewis. Well, why did I get it from Lewis? Because it's the right word. And what we're seeing now is that some ideas are parasites on the world, but a parasite is so much weaker than the host. And hosts that, in a sense, Ayan Hirsi Ali talked to Peterson, and I didn't make a video on that, but what in that conversation stood out to me, and she talked about the loss of confidence, and in some ways, I think the West is giving in to its parasites, and it's Peterson that says, don't lie and make yourself weak, and so what's happening. Well,
so that's why Christian form is that it also has to include the world of manifestation.
And manifestation is probably broader. You've got the physicality, and you've got the physicality in context of the story verse.
I mean, it can't just be a story. It has to be connected to the world. So that's why Christians insist on the fact that Jesus is not just a story, that he's an incarnated man, that he was incarnated.
But I don't believe their insistence. I don't believe that, well, this is because it isn't obvious to me, and I think maybe I derived this criticism from Nietzsche, but people have asked me whether or not I believe in God, and I've answered in various ways.
This is where I'm going to stop for now, because this is getting into the meat of it, and my time is running out, and my appointment is coming, and I'm just simply going to have to pick this up at another time. So sorry about that. Like I said before, I was going to make a video about the church today, and Jordan in some ways intersects with a lot of my thoughts about the church.
No, but I'm afraid he probably exists. This is because it isn't obvious to me, and I think maybe I derived this criticism from Nietzsche, but people have asked me whether or not I believe in God, and I've answered in various ways. No, but I'm afraid he probably exists. That's one answer. Yeah, no, but I'm terrified he might exist. That would be truthful answer to some degree, or that I act as if God exists, which I think is, I do my best to do that. But then there's a real stumbling block there, because there's no limit to what would happen if you acted like God existed.
Ravi Zacharias. And Esther in the tweet basically said, well, Jordan's, Ravi Zacharias, the pedophile priest scandals, all of this stuff gets the news, and it's not okay. Well, let's think about one of the lessons of the Gospels. If, let's say, Jordan has done a better than average job of discerning elements of the nature of reality. Let's assume Jordan, by virtue of his extensive work in maps of meaning, his decades of fearlessly exploring, trying to find that meeting point of chaos and order, trying to figure it out, has now come to the place where he is speaking and embodying truth at a higher, purer level than many others around him, to the degree that when he talks about personal responsibility, crowds get hushed. How is that supposed to play out in the world? So according to Christians, the story of Jesus goes like this. The perfect, sinless Son of God comes into the world and lives among us, and at the age of 30 begins a public ministry. Then just read the Gospels. Is he popular? Yeah. Is he killed by people that, well, they should be on the same side of the opposition against Roman oppression? Yeah, they had a hand in it. And the Romans had a hand in it. In other words, built into the story of Jesus is the assertion that if you actually live according to the truth, this world is going to kill you. Read the prologue of the Gospel of John. The light comes into the world, and the darkness could not. And that's where New Testament scholars sort of could not understand it, could not overcome it. You get the sense that there's a Greek word there that has a bunch of different, and I haven't looked it up right now, but a bunch of different elements in it that we can't quite grasp. But if again you assume, and I love where Jordan goes in this video with this, if you assume the truth of the Christian assertions, it is making a statement that just on the face of it means prosperity gospel has no leg to stand on. Because the kind of assumption we have, and this, Jesus deconstructs the karma assumptions about the nature of the world. And those karmic assumptions about the nature of the world are recognized in a lot of different places. In natural theology in some ways. In if I can only eat organic, natural things, then what? Then my health will be great. Okay. And the assumption is that if morally I do what's right, then what? Then you'll be rewarded. And so, again, in Brett Weinstein's sort of Gnostic way in there, where, well, racism and genocide are natural. They're products of evolutionary development. The dissonance that Jesus raises, and he doesn't just raise it with Romans. In fact, Romans aren't paying much attention to him. And when Jesus, tries to go on vacation and meets the Syrophoenician woman and basically says, hey, I'm not on the clock here. Can you give me a break? Do I really need to heal your daughter? He doesn't really say it that way. But built into the story the idea that if you do everything right, the world will hand you all of your dreams on a platter is deconstructed by Jesus. And so let's assume for a minute that Jordan Peterson and all of his brilliance and all of his smarts and all of his work on all of the deep stuff that he's been doing, and here you have, bona fide, lifelong Christian Jonathan Pageau, who's been an evangelical and now is Orthodox and understands the symbolism master. That Jordan gets all of this stuff right, and he suffers. What does that say? This gets into, I should pull up that tweet. This gets into my point. Jordan's haunting question is the question I hear asked in 100 different forms and ways inside and outside the church, and is implicit in every cry of despair and longing for shalom. Actually, the previous tweet. The big impression I have is the repeated haunting question Jordan Peterson asks about why hasn't the church manifest this vision of theosis sufficiently that what? So if the Son of God comes and manifests this vision of theosis perfectly, he gets across. That's what the world dishes up to him. And so I have absolutely no problem when people say to me, why would you try to sell me Christianity? Because if you live it perfectly, you get a cross. I said, yeah, and you get a resurrection. Yeah, but I don't know if I believe that part. And I don't know if I believe it physically. I don't know if I it's a nice story, and Neo comes back to life, and Harry Potter comes back to life, and I mean the Christ move is all over modern storytelling and cinema, but it stays in the story. And of course, this is where Pageau makes the point that if this is how reality is laid out, then this is how our stories will work. That's the point. And so Jordan is wrestling with the church and thinking, well, what should the church look like? Well, yeah, Jordan's absolutely right. The church should look a lot better than it looks now. But consider how Jesus looked. And again, there's all these different elements to it. On one hand, he was enormously popular, and sometimes we read the Gospels and we just fall in love with him. But I think part of that is we're not reading it very carefully. So again, look at my sermon this last Sunday. Read Luke 12. Jesus is invited to the house of the Pharisees. He doesn't wash. The Pharisees are like, we noticed you didn't wash. Yeah, because you're hypocrites. And then the teachers of the law say, hey, you're insulting us too. And Jesus, were you looking for an insult? Try this one on. And the crowd follows him and says, this wicked generation asks for a sign, and I will give them the sign of Jonah. And you just watch the things that Jesus says, and you watch the things that Jesus does. And again, it's all in my sermon from last week. You look at what Kenneth Bailey, I mean, he's teaching students in Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War, and he is helping them to read the text in the light of the Jewish culture war. And they are saying, I don't know why they didn't kill him sooner. Because if you act like this, you die. It's the person at the Antifa rally that says, we're going to be into nonviolence. Well, I'll show you nonviolence. Or it's the person at the standing at the gate of the Capitol saying, no, this isn't right. Whoosh, down you go. When the mob mentality takes over, well, mobs get violent. That's how human beings do. And this is always this thing that Brett Weinstein sort of talks about, but never actually addresses, is, Brett, where do your good ideas come from? Where does this morality that you want to, that you assume that all of us comes from? And of course, Tom Holland comes in with the Sunday school answer and says, Jesus. But the man who lived the best life has a crappy life. He doesn't have any FU money. when he's crucified, they divide his stuff, and most of it isn't worth. There was only one article that belonged to him that was worth casting lots over because they didn't want to rip it. Okay, back to the video.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because I believe that acting that out fully, I mean, maybe it's not reasonable to say to believers, you aren't sufficiently transformed for me to believe that you believe in God, or that you believe the story that you're telling me. You're not a sufficient, you're not, the way you live.
You're not a good enough witness. You will be my witnesses. You're going to be kind of crappy witnesses.
Isn't to believe the story that you're telling me. You're not a sufficient, the way you live isn't sufficient testament to the truth. And
That's
people would certainly say that, let's say, about the Catholic Church, or at least the way that it's been portrayed, is that with all the sexual corruption, for example, it's like, really, you believe that.
And it scales because, okay, so Jordan is looking at the Catholic Church. He's looking at the whole thing. And okay, it hasn't scaled for the whole thing. Adjust my camera again. Put it down a little bit. It doesn't scale for the whole thing. Okay, well, how about individuals? And that's where Pageau's going to go. Pageau's going to say, well, what about saints? And yeah, fair enough. But here's the thing about a saint: do you really want to be one? I mean, and Pageau is, he's dealing with a non-Protestant tradition that has monks and so, some of them are beings of light, as Jonathan will say in other words in a minute. And Jordan is like, okay, well, I'm looking at you, but what is it exactly you're looking for? Because Jesus comes and, well, again, it's all in the Gospels. He comes and he is, he multiplies wine and, well, you're a drunkard. And then he goes up into a mountain alone and, well, what? No miracles for Nazareth? Come on, do here what you did in Capernaum. This is right at the center of Christianity. It's not that Jesus lives this, he has all of this power, and so he has great health, and his wife never gets cancer, and his daughter has perfect health, and the life that all of us would want for our daughters to have, and his books sell 1 million copies, and everyone drips on his word, and when he goes and does an interview for a magazine, they give him good press. That wasn't Jesus.
The Son of God, that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, and yet you act that way, and I'm supposed to buy your belief. And
people said exactly the same thing to Jesus. You're the Son of God, and they still do it today. And you talk that way to the Syrophoenician woman? Well, and they said, well, maybe it's that God from the Old Testament that put Jericho under the ban.
It seems to me that the church is actually quite guilty on that account, because the attempts to clean up the mess have been rather half-hearted in my estimation.
And there are way more messes than just the sex stuff. That's just the beginning of the mess. I've told this story before. So one of my Old Testament professors was part of the NIV translation team. And that was known in the Christian Reformed Church. And so, he's a seminary professor, but he goes to a church and he has a regular life. And, people would come up to his church and they'd be reading the NIV, and it would change from the RSV or the KJV or maybe the Way, which was the predecessor to the New Living Translation. And they would come in and say, I don't really like the decision that was made here in this translation. Why was it changed? And he would say, you don't like just this one. I work with a committee. I've got hundreds of things I don't like that are in this Bible with my name on it on the translating committee. You can look outside, and what makes the press? It's Ravi Zachariah, and it's the pedophile priest, and it's Cardinal Bucarik, and it's on and on and on and on. And even John Paul, even sainted, and Roman Catholic Church, they actually do the saint thing. Even sainted John Paul II didn't clean up the scandal as well as he could have. And Ravi Zachariah, this, I see a lot of people talking about Ravi, and it's always the same thing. It's the celebrity culture and it's accountability. But what Jordan is pointing out here is an even deeper issue. What if we embodied Jesus perfectly? Would we do anything less than kill him? And that's where the brothers Karamazov and the Grand Inquisitor little story comes into play. We would kill him again. Now, maybe, hopefully, by virtue of Christianity, we would pause, but what's he going to say to his church? If you're a pastor, you got to be a little nervous.
Yeah.
And so I don't think Christians don't manifest this, and I'm including myself, I suppose, in that description. Perhaps don't manifest.
See, on the audio, I couldn't see the look, and it's just too funny.
The transformation of attitude that would enables the outside observer to easily conclude that they believe.
Yeah.
And this gets into, one of my favorite things that I picked up from Tim Keller, who got it from Jonathan Edwards. These really, they're incongruent excellencies that we see in Jesus. He is more demanding than we think reasonable. He is more merciful than we think responsible. This is what we see in him. And this is part of the reason we can't see God and live, because it would be so absolutely soul-crushing for ourselves. And so the church is sort of, you might wonder what I always got different drinks of choice, and this is some tea, and I keep putting ice cubes in it so it gets weaker and weaker and weaker until it's all gone. And so the church is like this weak tea, always diluted, but it's not just tea. It's got, it's an open glass, and somebody put in some cigarette butts and some scrapings from the floor, and that's what you find. But the problem is, we assume that we knew what the tea tastes like. And this, again, is part of C.S. Lewis's argument for the existence of God that he puts in Mere Christianity, that we somehow have this imagination. Okay, we do better, and we have an imagination for something better, but somehow we have this hope of actually seeing the real deal.
Now, the way to deal with that, or the way to understand that, is that they do in a hierarchy. There's a hierarchy of manifestation of the transformation that God offers the world, and we kind of live in that hierarchy, and those above us hold us together, you would say. And so in the church, there's a testimony of the saints. There are stories. There are hundreds and hundreds of stories of people.
Now, it's really helpful, and I really like Jonathan's answer here, because, it's in a hierarchy, and so it's distributed, but it's also sort of held together in a distributed self. It's the body of Christ. And because we as individuals struggle to manifest the incongruent excellencies of Christ in ourselves. So Paul, he's probably too nice and not demanding enough. Jordan, maybe he's more on the demanding side if we want to put him in Christ here. If he wishes to be numbered in the fellowship. And so the body of Christ has that, and so the Apostle Paul has it distributed through members. So I do like Jonathan's answer here.
People who live that out in their particular context to the limit of what it's possible to live it. And even today, there are saints, living saints, who, for example, like in the Orthodox tradition, we have this idea of what they call it, the gift of tears, or the joyful sorrow of people who live in prayer with weeping, constant weeping. and it's this kind of strange mix of joy and sadness, which kind of overwhelm them, and they live in that joy and sadness nonstop, and they pray, without end. And so that exists. But then that's one of the reasons why. That's kind of one of the reasons why when I talk about this idea of attention, like it manifests itself in the church as well, is that you often say, and I understand it, when you say something like, I act as if God exists, or, I'm afraid to say that God exists. And I think it's because you think, or you tend to think that the moral weight of that is so strong that we would crumble under it, that you would just be crushed under it. And I think
believe
that. And I think I understand that, but.
And again, before I let Jonathan finish, again, I saw another comment today. It's like, you keep interrupting them. Watch the original, please. I'm not in that video. 100 times more people will see that video than this video. I don't know why the poor YouTube algorithm has sent you here, but sorry about that. I've distracted myself and I forgot.
And I think that
oh yeah, the crushing. And this follows Jordan's. It was always in Australia that he gave the more religious talks, which was really interesting. But this follows that video that Jordan made about, believing in God. And yeah, the moral weight. That's right. Read the Sermon on the Mount. It will crush you, but then my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Well, what do you mean by that? And actually, I believe Jordan's going to talk about that here too. And how can we understand that? And so
I understand that. But the first thing to act as if God exists, let's say it this way, to act as if God exists, the first thing that it asks of you is not a moral action. The first thing that it asks of you is attention. That's why to act as if God exists is first of all to worship. And I know people are going to hear this.
Well, then I have a terrible problem with that too at the moment, because I'm in so much pain. Like one of the things that one of these theologians discussed the idea of, and sorry,
boy, this book really got in his head.
Let you get back to your point, but he discussed the idea of the yoke of Christ being light and that there was joy in it. And there's a paradox there, obviously, because it's also a take up your cross and follow me sort of thing. But the fact that I've been living in constant pain makes the idea of joy seem cruel, I would say. And I have no idea how to reconcile myself to that. I mean, I've reconciled myself to that by staying alive, despite it. Although by staying alive despite it, but there's very little worship. And it doesn't mean I'm not appreciative of what I have. I'm not only am I appreciative of what I have, I do everything I can to remind myself of it all the time. And so does my wife. I mean, she's changed quite a bit as a consequence of her struggle with cancer, has become much more overtly religious, I would say. And, we say grace before our meal in the evening, and it's a very serious enterprise. And it always centers around gratitude, for the ridiculous volume of blessings that have been showered down upon us at a volume that's really quite incomprehensible. But despite that, despite that, I'm struggling with this because I don't know how to reconcile myself to the fact of constant pain.
Yeah.
And I feel that it's...
And I think Jonathan handles this perfectly.
...unjust, which is halfway to being resentful, which is not a good outcome.
No, I agree. And I can't...
At this point, you just put your arm around him and pray for him. I mean, that's...
speak. Like I don't know how to speak to that because I don't necessarily don't have that experience. I don't have that. I don't live with constant pain. And so I don't know what that would do to me. Probably one of the reasons why it might ruin me, And so, it's very difficult to answer that. I think that the answer has been the cross. Like that's been the answer. It's maybe easy for me to just say it that way. But that's always been the answer of Christianity, which is that God went to the cross and that God went down into death and plunged down into death. And there are mysteries hidden. And they're very well hidden, but there are mysteries hidden in that depth.
And so this is where you get into the question of practice and answers, because Jordan has lost his health. Skin for skin. For Job lost his children, he lost his wealth, and he loses his health. And his wife says, curse God and die. That's the bitterness, and Job doesn't go there. And Jordan isn't going there. And Job seeks an answer. It's important to recognize that, because when Jordan talks like this, if he were in my office or in my church building, what that would lead me to do is not give him an answer. I don't have an answer for him. Jonathan doesn't have an answer for him. What I would give him is a prayer. And what I would give him is presence. I just read the comments I've been dribbling out this video, and tomorrow I'll just put a whole bunch of these together. It'll be some crazy long video, but I'll try and segment it so people can see if they've watched part of it, so they don't have to repeat the part and they can see the new parts. I mentioned before that I have a friend who has quite a miraculous gift of healing, and it doesn't mean that every time he prays for someone they are healed. But there have been times in his life, and he's not a liar, and he earns absolutely no money or anything from me by telling me these stories, but he prays for someone, and that person's trauma or torment goes on him, and the other person is relieved of it. C.S. Lewis says an almost exact similar story about Joy Davidman. This one of the persons, and the person in the comments said, I wonder if Jordan prayed for his wife. And she received a miraculous healing, and he now in some ways is bearing her pain. And if he knew he was bearing her pain, and this was the relationship, would it be different for him to take on? The book of Hebrews talks about, and a lot of sermons have been preached on this, Jesus does it for us. When a mother goes through the agony of childbirth, she is giving life. When a parent Jordan sacrifices for his daughter, there's fruit.
But it's not. I don't think it's my job to moralize to you at this particular moment.
So we talked about the narrative and the objective touching, and so I wanted to touch on that again. Is that like I understand C.S. Lewis's argument, and I'm even inclined from time to time to think, well, I've got the choice between believing two impossible things. I can either believe that the world is constituted so that God took on flesh and was crucified and died and rose 3 days later. Or I can believe that human beings invented this unbelievably preposterous story that stretched into every atom of culture. And it isn't obvious to me that the second hypothesis is any easier to believe than the first, because the more you investigate the manifestations of the story of Christ, the more insanely complicated and far-reaching it becomes. So I read Ion, for example, and for all of those who are listening, if you want to read a book that will completely make you insane, then you could read Jung's Ion. And it's a study of Christian symbolism in astrology, which doesn't sound particularly dangerous, but or even particularly necessary to read, I suppose. But Jung describes the juxtaposition of astrological and Christian symbolism, and it's a brilliant book, and it's terrifying because he outlines the concordance between the levels of symbolism over several thousand years. And it's obvious when you read the book that no one plotted this. It's not a conspiracy. Whatever's going on to make that concordance occur isn't something that we understand, and it seems to be best understood as one of these situations where the narrative and the objective touch. The saturation of Christianity with fish symbolism, Jung associates with astrological movement of into the house of Pisces. And so he describes how a drama, so ancient people saw a drama played out in the sky, and that was a projection of their imagination. And that projection contained symbols that were associated with the emergence of Christianity. And so you can see in that the alternative explanation is that there's this unfolding of a symbolic landscape over centuries or millennia that's part of human biological and cultural evolution. But that starts to touch on the religious anyways when you describe it in those terms. Like it's the operation of a natural cognitive process, let's say natural/cognitive process that supersedes any one individual or any one culture. And so I've never seen a critique of Ion. I think people read that book and they think, oh, it's
The Uberboyos have one.
like John Allegro's The Mushroom and the Sacred Cross. Do you know of that book? I believe that's the title. Well, that's another book you read and you think, well, I have no idea what... It's a study of mushroom symbolism in Christianity. And it's another book that, it claims that Christianity was heavily influenced by psilocybin use, and it was published in the 1960s. It's an amazing book. But it's another book you read and you think, I have no idea what to do with that. I have no place to put that book. So, but Ion is really like that. And
well, one of the things that, for example, you talked about just before, the idea that, the idea of Christ being a dying and resurrecting God, and, that's really actually not the case. If you actually just look at the story of Christ, and not just the story in Scripture, but let's say the whole story as it kind of developed in tradition and kind of melded together. In the ancient world, you had this idea of gods that went down into the underworld. Either that went down for some reason to visit, or went down to save somebody even, or died and then rose again. But that's actually not the story of Christ, because if you understand the full tradition of the Christian story, we think that Christ died, went into Hades, and then destroyed death. And the
Apostles' Creed.
He pulls everybody out of death, and then that's it. Like, what other story are you going to tell after that story? You have a story of someone who dies, goes into death, and then destroys death, and then that's it. Like that.
Read The Grand Miracle in C.S. Lewis's book Miracle. You can find it, C.S. Lewis Doodles, online. You can find C.S. Lewis often had these essays that were parts of his books, and they're out there. But The Grand Miracle, it's basically what Lewis says. This is the missing chapter in the story. If this fits into your world, suddenly the rest makes sense.
That's the thing with Christ's story, that every story, every aspect of his story reaches the limit of storytelling. And it's impossible to go beyond it.
Right, that's right. Well, even from a psychological perspective, that's correct. And that in itself is a kind of miracle. And so you're stuck in some sense constantly having to choose between miracles. It's like, okay, it's a figment of the human imagination. Fine, but it's the limit figment in multiple ways. How did that happen?
And also, but as soon as you start to think that the world is made of attention, the idea of just a figment of somebody's imagination, especially just a figment of someone's imagination, which happens, like you said, over thousands of years within communities of thousands of people, it just becomes a ridiculous statement. It doesn't mean anything. It's like,
yeah, it only means something if you assume that, and Jung pointed this out, it only means something. To say it's a figment of imagination and have that brush it aside means that you think that imagination is nothing. And Jung pointed out constantly that you should not attribute nothing to the psyche. It's what you depend upon. It's the ground of your existence. It's not nothing. It's the thing that you take for granted more than anything else.
So anything that you can recognize as a story will definitely be manifesting patterns that you can recognize. And so they can't just be brushed aside from the most insane conspiracy theory to the most, like childish fairy tale. Anything that manifests itself as a pattern of story that you can recognize has a certain level of value, has enough level that if you pay attention to it, you actually can gather some nuggets of how the world works and how the world lays itself out. And that's why, like, if I do symbolic interpretations, I can do it for scripture, but I can also do it for some Marvel movie or some video game or whatever it is, because that's just for you to even recognize something as having being, it's already part of that world. It's already manifesting these patterns.
This critic said that the mere psychologization of Christ was insufficient because, and you made the same case in some sense, that it doesn't make sense unless the narrative and the objective world truly touch. And I think
Well, exactly, because there's always a correspondence. We tell stories that correspond, and if there's no correspondence, the story's just floating out there.
could debate that, because I think that there's some utility. There could arguably be some utility in a secular version of the hero myth, that the best way to cope with existence is to tell the truth and to face what you don't know forthrightly, and that will enable you to orient yourself within our finite and bounded existence that ends with our death more properly, more accurately, more advisedly than any other route.
I've seen people from Orthodox priests to, the most Protestant you can imagine, recognize in the way that you represent reality something that has value, because you are manifesting.
I'm a Protestant.
That pattern, like what you're saying is true. But I think that if we take seriously the relationship between attention, psyche, and the way the world reveals itself to us, then it scales up. It scales up after that. It jumps up a level, and it also scales up in terms of, because one of the things that you talk about, like looking up to the star and looking up to the highest thing you can look at, and then aiming towards that, once again, one of the things that does is that the first thing you do is actually it's attention. The people won't like the word worship. It's a form of reverence, a form of veneration. You submit yourself to that aim. So it's not just that you see the aim and that you aim for it. You actually have to submit yourself to that which is to what you're aiming. And
again, I understand post Christian tyranny syndrome here, but even when Jonathan is talking about it, you submit yourself to it. You orient yourself by it. And the orientation to it is itself a form of submission. Think about that. If let's say you're a 17th century sailor and you are navigating by the stars, getting across the Atlantic, you orient yourself by the stars. In that sense, you submit yourself to the stars. You say, the star knows better than I do. I am going to alter my course according to the orientation of this. And what worship is the continual rehearsal and practice of that. And you can find this in Roman Catholic liturgy. You can find this in Orthodox liturgy. You can find this in liturgy in many religions. You orient by that. And again, back to Jordan's, Christ is the ideal person. You orient according to that. I mean, even just those silly plastic armbands. What would Jesus do? You're orienting to that. And that is a form of worship.
And so that's
sacrifice to it.
Exactly. And you have to sacrifice to it. And so that's why, let's say, the religious version.
And if you're sailing that ship, what do you mean I'm sacrificing to it? It means that you're staying up at night. You're showing discipline. You're sacrificing the urges to, just go in a circle or whatever crazy thing you want to do. It's a discipline. It's a discipleship.
Of this has to move towards the highest possible aim. And
right.
Also one that we can do together, because like the lower aims,
and that's a critical point, one that we can do together, because if you're aiming by yourself, well, remember earlier we talked about the fact that we're always orienting ourselves by other persons. So you not only have to aim by yourself, you not only have to aim, but you're talking because you want everyone else to aim. C.S. Lewis says, praise is inner health made audible. And so we don't do it by ourselves, because if we just do it by ourselves and everybody else is going in different ways, it isn't as satisfying, it isn't as productive. And so this is why it's done in community and not just all by yourself.
You could call them something like lower gods, let's say, or angels, or whatever you want to call them. Like these lower aims, they have value, but they're all fragmented. But for this to stack up, we need to be able to look towards the same image. We need to look towards the same aim, and that will bind us together. And so we don't also end up being just kind of individuals who have the weight of the world on our shoulders, but we're a communion of saints. We're a communion of people who are submitted to, aiming towards, worshiping the same point.
Yeah, and I believe that that's necessary. And I've had some profound experiences, which I can't really relate here, that of the necessity for that community is that this, whatever our fundamental moral load is, immense though it is, crushing though it is even, requires the participation of others. So even if you were the perfect you would need other people to be along with you. It's a collective enterprise, even though it's an individualistic, even though it requires the perfection, it requires as much perfection as is possible at the individual level. That's not enough. There has to be that communal element as well. You need help. We all need help to aim as high. The highest aim requires communal endeavor.
Yeah. And it's also because it actually is the way that everything works. It's like the chair aiming to be a chair is a constitutive of parts which are joined together towards a same goal, and therefore hold together as a being and manifest the chairness of the chair. And that's the same with you. You have all these thoughts, right? You have all these feelings, all these contradicting things inside you, and you need, by aiming up towards, I believe that the image of Christ, let's say, by aiming towards the image of Christ, you constitute your being into that being that's able to attend, to sacrifice, to love, and then that scales up with people.
I agree.
People
together.
And
I think you are aiming, and this is something else I tried to point out to Sam. You are...
Poor Sam. Couldn't learn, wouldn't listen.
You're either aiming at Christ or something lesser.
Yeah.
Or if things get really out of hand, you're aiming at something opposite, and you don't want to be doing that. And this is a matter of definition in some sense, and it's actually not impossible to understand, is that you aim at something better, generally speaking. I mean, maybe you're out to cause pain, but forget about that. You aim at something better. You wouldn't do it unless it was better. In fact, it virtually defines better. Like the whole idea of better is predicated on the idea that there's an aim that's beyond you. And then the highest of those aims is the highest aim is the amalgamation of all higher aims. And that's a perfect mode of being. And that by definition, that's a psychological perspective again. That by definition is Christ. But then there seems to be something too convenient about C.S. Lewis's insistence that also had to manifest itself concretely in reality at one point in history. And I'm not like,
This is another point I really want to get on, and I've got to stop now because I've got an appointment. So I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to want to come back to that, because in one way, Jordan's critique of the church is, if it were real, it would manifest. And in a sense, he just flipped that around and said, C.S. Lewis basically said, if it's real, it will manifest. And Jordan says, I'm a little worried that's a little too convenient. No, if it's real, it'll manifest. And that's essentially, and Jonathan's going to go there, that's essentially the story of the gospel. But I have to leave it here for now. And yeah, this is going to be a big video. I'm 55 minutes into it, so it's about halfway. Oh boy. So yeah, some of you have been complaining, well, the videos have been kind of short lately. Well, your time has come.